Clara Whitmore dropped the rotted slab of pork on Ethan Caldwell's desk and pressed her thumb clean through the gray meat until it split. "This is what's meant to feed your men through winter," she said. 3 weeks, and it'll be bones and prayers." The ranch hands in the doorway laughed at the fat woman in the patched apron. Ethan Caldwell did not laugh. He'd buried his wife, buried half his herd, and buried every dollar he had left in the ground, and this stranger was the first soul in 2 years to tell him the truth to his face. If you're watching this, do me a kindness. Subscribe to the channel. Stay with me all the way to the end of Clara's story, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel and who they reach. Now settle in, because this one earns every minute. The pork hit the desk, and nobody in that little ranch office said a word for a long moment. Ethan Caldwell looked at the ruined meat, then at his own thumb, then at the woman who'd carried it 3 miles from town in a leather bag just to slap the truth down in front of him. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't sweetened it either. She'd simply told him the thing he already knew and had been too tired to say out loud. "Where'd you get that off my land?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Off your smokehouse shelf, the one you left unlocked because you figured there wasn't anything left in there worth stealing." Clara wiped her hand on a rag she pulled from her apron pocket. "You figured right. There ain't. But that's not because your smokehouse can't hold meat, Mr. Caldwell. It's because nobody's tended it since your bad luck started, and bad luck don't cure pork. Salt does. Smoke does. A person who knows what they're doing does." Behind her in the open doorway, a ranch hand named Del Rooney snorted. He was young, broad through the shoulders, and quick with his mouth. "You hear that boy's lady walked in off the road and she's already running the place." "Del." Ethan didn't look up. "I'm just saying." "Then don't." The younger man shut his mouth, but the smirk stayed. There were 3 of them clustered at the door now, drawn by the sight of a stranger, and drawn more by the sight of a stranger they'd already decided was a joke. Clara felt their eyes travel over her, the way eyes always did. She was a large woman, near 150 kilograms, and she had spent 29 years watching people size her up and set her aside in the same breath. She knew the exact shape of the look. She'd stopped flinching from it a long time ago. She turned her back on the 3 of them and gave Ethan Caldwell her full attention instead. "You posted for someone to fix the smokehouse and salt your winter pork," she said. "I walked out here to take the work. I've been curing meat since I was old enough to reach the hooks. My father taught me coarse salt hardwood temperature patience. That's the whole of it, and the whole of it is more than most men on a ranch this size have got. I'm not asking you to trust me on my word. I'm asking you to let me open that building and get to work, and to judge me on what comes out of it. Give me that, and I'll give you a full smokehouse before the first hard freeze." Ethan finally raised his eyes to her. He was 38, weathered past his years, a mountain rancher folks in the county called hardworking and distant, in the same sentence as though those were 2 sides of a coin and you couldn't hold one without the other. He had a way of looking at a person like he was deciding how much of what they said to believe. Clara held still under it. She'd been looked at worse. "You know what I lost this year," he said. "No, sir. Near half my herd. 2 harvests before that." He leaned back and the old chair creaked under him. "I've got 9 hands on this ranch, and I can feed maybe 5 through winter on what's cured. And what's cured is that." He nodded at the gray slab. "The rest'll ride out before the snow flies. They already know it. They're just waiting on the courtesy of the first cold morning to tell me." "Then I don't understand why you're arguing with the one person who walked out here to fix it." Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Ethan Caldwell wasn't a man who'd smiled much lately, but something. "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm making sure you understand what you're walking into. If you take this and you fail, it's not a lost wage. It's men gone hungry. It's a ranch that don't come back from it. I understand that better than you do." "How's that?" Clara set the leather bag on the floor by her feet and folded her hands in front of her patched apron. "Because you've had this ranch your whole life, Mr. Caldwell, and I've never had anything at all. You lose this place. You lose a thing you love. I fail out here. I lose the only work in 3 counties that a man was willing to hand me before he got a good look at my size. I know exactly what's on the table. I've been staring at it since the day I could walk." The office went quiet again. Del Rooney had stopped smirking. Ethan Caldwell studied her for a long time, and then he did a thing he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He reached into the desk drawer, pulled out an old iron key gone orange with rust, and set it on the desk between them next to the ruined meat. "Smokehouse is yours," he said. "You want salt? You tell my foreman. You want hardwood? You tell him. You need time." He paused. "You've got till the freeze, and the freeze don't ask permission." Clara looked at the key. She did not reach for it right away, and that surprised him. He'd expected her to snatch it like a starving woman takes bread. Instead, she looked at it the way a person looks at a promise they mean to keep. "One thing," she said. "Name it. I need the smokehouse to be mine while I'm working it. Not yours, not your foreman's, not his." She tipped her head toward Del without turning around. "Mine. Nobody comes in and moves my salt or opens my door in the night to check the fire and lets the heat out. Nobody laughs at a batch that's still curing and calls it wasted before it's done. I can save your winter, Mr. Caldwell, but I can't do it in a building where every man on the place thinks he knows better than me and hasn't cured a pound of meat in his life." Behind her, Del opened his mouth. Ethan looked past Clara's shoulder and fixed the young man with a stare that closed it again. "It's hers," Ethan said. "Anybody's got a problem with that, they can take it up with me, and I'll tell them the same thing I'm about to tell you all. Now, I don't much care what she looks like. I care whether my men eat in January. She says she can make that happen. Nobody else who walked out here this fall said a word except how sorry they were." He stood. "That's the end of it." Clara picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in her palm, and heavier still for what it meant. She closed her fingers around it. "Thank you," she said. Not to the room, to him. Ethan Caldwell only nodded, and for a moment the two of them stood there, the rancher who'd run out of luck, and the woman the whole county had already counted out, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for yet. Then the moment closed, the way such moments do, and there was work to be done. She walked out past the 3 ranch hands, and they parted for her, though not kindly. Del Rooney touched the brim of his hat in a way that was meant to mock her and said, "After you, ma'am," in a voice dripping with everything he didn't say. Clara stopped in front of him. She was near his height and twice his patience. "You're the one made the joke about smoked dreams," she said quietly. "Out in the yard when I was walking up. You didn't think I heard it." Del's ears went red. I heard it. I hear most everything. People say things around a woman my size like she can't hear, same as they say things around a chair." She let that sit. "You're gonna eat this winter, Mr. Rooney. And when you're eating, I'd take it kindly if you remembered whose dreams put the food on your plate." She walked on before he could answer. She did not look back to see the look on his face, but she felt it follow her all the way across the yard, and she'd have been lying if she said she didn't feel a small, hard satisfaction in it. The smokehouse sat behind the barn, like something the ranch had given up on. It was a squat log building, older than the barn, its door hanging crooked on a hinge that had gone loose years back. Clara fit the iron key to the lock, worked it until the rust gave, and pulled the door open. The smell hit her first. Cold ash, old grease, damp wood. The smell of a place that had stopped being useful. She stepped inside anyway. The fire pit was full of dead ash gone gray and packed hard. The hooks along the beam were rusted, 3 of them broken clean off. The salt box in the corner was empty, and the wood of it had swollen with damp so the lid wouldn't sit right. Every surface wore a fur of dust. To a man who didn't know better, it was a ruin. It was a building to be torn down for the logs. Clara stood in the middle of it and turned slow, and where a man saw a ruin, she saw the bones of a thing that had once worked and could work again. "There you are," she said softly to the building, the way her father used to talk to a smokehouse when he walked into one. "There you are. You've just been left alone too long. That's all. That's the whole of it. She set her bag down, rolled her sleeves, and got to work. By the time the light started to go, she'd hauled the dead ash out by the bucketful, scrubbed the fire pit down to clean stone, and pulled the broken hooks. Her arms ached in the good way she'd known her whole life, the ache of work that meant something. She was on her knees in front of the pit, testing the draw of the old chimney with a handful of dry straw and a match when a shadow fell across the door. She didn't turn around. "If you're here to move my salt, I don't have any yet." "I'm not here to move anything." She knew the voice. She got to her feet and turned, and Ethan Caldwell was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which she'd already learned in one afternoon wasn't a thing he did easily. "I came to see if you had what you needed," he said. "I've got what I need to clean. I'll need the salt and the wood tomorrow, and I gave your foreman the list." "He gave it to me. It's a lot of salt." "It's the right amount of salt. Too little, and the meat spoils in the middle where you can't see it till you cut in, and it's too late. That's what happened to the batch on your shelf. Somebody salted it light to save money, and it looked fine, and then it rotted from the inside where nobody could tell." She wiped her hands. Curing meat's a lot like people that way. You can't judge whether it's gone bad from the outside. He looked at her when she said it, and she wondered if he'd caught her meaning, and decided she didn't much care if he had. "You'll get your salt," he said. "Then I'll get you your winter." He lingered a moment longer than the conversation called for. She watched him take in the cleaned fire pit, the pulled hooks laid out in a neat row, the swept floor. She watched him do the arithmetic she'd already done, that in one afternoon, a place he'd written off had started coming back. "How long since anybody kept this fire?" she asked. 2 years. He said it flat, but there was a weight under it, and Clara had spent her life listening for the weight under flat words. 2 years, she repeated. Same as the drought. Same as a lot of things. He put his hat back on, which meant he was leaving, which meant she'd gotten too near something. "Get some rest. You'll want it. First real cold's not far off. Mr. Caldwell." He stopped. "There's a room I can have." The foreman said the bunkhouse, but not the bunkhouse. He said it too quick and then slower, catching himself. "There's a room off the kitchen in the main house. It was the cook's back when we had a cook. It's small, but it's got a stove and a door that locks. You'll take that." "That's kind of you." "It ain't kindness, it's sense. I put you in the bunkhouse with those men, and half my winters spent breaking up trouble." But he said it with something that wasn't quite gruffness, and Clara let him keep the dignity of pretending it was only sense. He left her there, and she went back to her fire, and when the straw finally caught, and the smoke pulled clean and straight up the old chimney, the way it was supposed to, she sat back on her heels and let out a breath she'd been holding since town. The building drew. The bones were good. She could work with good bones. That night she took her supper alone in the little room off the kitchen, and through the wall she heard the ranch hands come in from the yard and settle at the long table for their own meal. She heard the low run of their talk, and then she heard her own name in it, and she heard Del Rooney's voice rise up over the rest. "Tellin' you boss has lost the thread. Woman that size, she'll be winded haulin' wood by the second day. We'll be smoking our own boots come Christmas." A few of them laughed. Then another voice older cut across it. "You seen the smokehouse tonight? Del walked past it." So she swept a floor. She cleaned that pit down to the stone and got the chimney drawing. 2 years that building's been dead, and she had smoke coming out of it by dark. When's the last time you drew smoke out of anything but your own mouth? That got a bigger laugh, and it wasn't at Clara, and she sat in the little room with her plate in her lap and let herself feel just for a moment the smallest lightening of the load she carried everywhere she went. It didn't last. It never did. But she'd learned to take it where she found it. The salt came the next morning and the hardwood after it. Good oak and a little apple that Clara sorted through piece by piece, while Del Rooney watched from the fence rail with his arms crossed and his opinion loud on his face. "That's a lot of fuss over firewood," he said. "It's not firewood." Clara set the apple wood aside, careful. "You burn oak for the heat, and you burn apple for the flavor near the end, and if you burn the wrong one at the wrong time, you can ruin a whole batch that took you 3 weeks. So yes, Mr. Rooney, it's a lot of fuss. That's the fuss. That's the difference between meat that feeds you and meat like what was on that shelf. My granddaddy cured hogs with whatever wood was closest. Then I'd wager your granddaddy lost a batch or two he didn't tell you about. She didn't look up. Every man who cures meat badly thinks he cures it fine, right up until the winter he finds out he don't. There's no arguing it in October. You'll know in January, same as everybody. Dell had no answer for that, which was she'd found the usual end of an argument with a man who'd never done the thing he had opinions about. She worked. That was the whole of the next stretch of days, and she worked the way she'd learned to work before light and after dark, methodical exact. She rebuilt the hooks and set them true. She rubbed the meat with the coarse salt in the amounts her father had drilled into her hands until they knew the measure without her mind. She built the first fire small and let the building learn heat again slowly, the way you gentle a thing that's been cold too long. She watched the color of the smoke like other people watch the weather, because to her it was the weather and a shift in it meant something, and she caught the shifts before they became mistakes. And Ethan Caldwell started coming to the smokehouse. The first time he told himself and told her he was checking the fire, which was a thing he had never once needed to do in 2 years of the building sitting dead. The second time, he didn't bother with a reason. He just stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and watched her work, and Clara let him, because a man watching quietly did no harm, and because though she'd not have admitted it under oath, she'd grown used to the shape of him in the doorway, and would have missed it if it stopped. They talked a little in the way of two people who each carried something heavy, and each recognized the way the other carried it. "You said your father taught you," Ethan said one evening. He was leaned in the doorway. She was turning a batch. "He have a place of his own. He worked other men's places, same as me." Clara's hands didn't stop. He was the best there was at it, and it never once bought him a place of his own, because a man who's good at the humble work stays humble in other men's eyes their whole life. I watched him teach ranchers half of what they knew, and I watched those same ranchers walk past him in town like they'd never met him. She paused over a hook. "I loved him more than anything on this earth, Mr. Caldwell, and I made up my mind young that I'd be twice as good as he was, and I'd still likely get half as far on account of what folks see when they look at me. And I made my peace with the getting half as far part. What I never made my peace with was doing the work badly, so I don't." He was quiet for a while. "He's still living?" "No, sir, 4 years now." "I'm sorry. So am I, every day." She set the hook and turned to him, and there was no self-pity in her face, only a plain, honest sorrow that was somehow harder to look at than tears would have been. "But he taught me a trade with my own 2 hands, and a trade is a thing nobody can take off you, or laugh out of you, or price down at the store. It's mine. It's the one thing that's always been mine. So when I stand in this smokehouse, Mr. Caldwell, I'm the richest woman in the county, and I don't much care who knows it or who don't believe it." Ethan Caldwell looked at her across the low red light of the fire, and Clara watched something in him she'd not seen in him before. Not the guarded weighing look he gave everyone, but something startled and almost wounded, like a man who'd been shown a thing he'd stopped believing existed. "I used to think that way," he said finally. "About this ranch. Richest man in the county. Didn't matter what was in the bank." He turned his hat in his hands. "Been a while since I felt it. You'll feel it again." "You don't know that. I know a smokehouse coming back to life," she said. "And I know a man following it back. Same as I know good bones from bad. You've got good bones, Mr. Caldwell. You've just been left alone too long. That's the whole of it." She hadn't meant to say it exactly like that, the same words she'd said to the building the day she opened it. But she'd said it, and it landed, and Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway of his own smokehouse with his hat in his hands and didn't say anything at all for a long moment, because there wasn't a thing to say that wouldn't have said too much. Then he put his hat on. "Get some rest," he said, rough again, safe again. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." He was near out the door when she spoke again. "You never told me what happened 2 years ago." He stopped in the doorway with his back to her. Clara didn't push it. She'd asked, and asking was as far as she'd go. The rest was his to give or keep. She went back to her fire. "My wife," Ethan said to the dark yard, not turning. "Fever took her, fast. Faster than anybody could get to us out here." He was quiet. Ranch started dying the same season. Drought, then the herd, then the harvest. Folks in town got a story they liked to tell that I lost my wife and lost my grip and let the place go to ruin around me. And the thing of it is... He stopped. The thing of it is, they're not all the way wrong. I did let it go. I looked at that smokehouse dead for 2 years, and I didn't have it in me to light it. I couldn't tend a fire in a building. I could barely tend myself. Clara stood very still. "And then you walked out here off the road," he said, "and lit it in an afternoon." He didn't wait for her to answer. He walked off across the dark yard toward the main house, and Clara stood in the warm red light of the fire she'd built in a dead man's building and understood for the first time exactly what it was she'd walked into. That this was not a smokehouse she was bringing back at all. Or not only that, and the stakes on the table were higher and stranger than winter meat. She turned the batch. She tended her fire. And she carried what he'd told her carefully, the way she carried everything worth carrying, and told nobody. It might have gone on that way, the slow warming of two careful people, if the town hadn't reached out to remind them both what the world thought of them. It came on a Thursday in the person of Harold Pierce. Pierce owned the general store in town, which meant Pierce owned in the way that mattered a great many of the ranchers in the valley, because a rancher who has a bad year buys on credit, and the man who holds the credit holds the man. He was well fed and well pleased with himself, and he drove out to the Caldwell Ranch that afternoon under the excuse of a delivery he could have sent with any boy in town. Clara was crossing the yard with a load of oak in her arms when his buggy came up the road, and she felt Pierce's eyes land on her, the way she'd felt 100 such landings. The quick pass over her body, the flicker of the mouth, the decision made and filed before a word was said. "Well?" Pierce said, climbing down. "Well, well, so the stories are true." He looked her up and down slow, so she'd know he was doing it. "Ethan Caldwell hired himself a lady to run his smokehouse. I confess I didn't credit it when I heard. I said no, not even Caldwell's fallen that far." He smiled at her, like she was a curiosity in his store window. "You'd be the one then, the one that's meant to save the ranch." He let a little laugh out. "Save it. My word." Clara did not put down the wood. She stood there with the oak in her arms, and she looked at Harold Pierce with a face that gave him exactly nothing, and she said, "I'd be the one, sir, and you'd be the man that sold Mr. Caldwell the light salt that spoiled his last batch from the inside. I found it on the shelf. Recognize the grade. It's the cheap grade you keep in the back and sell to men who've had a bad year and can't argue the price." Pierce's smile stayed, but it went stiff at the edges. "I sell what men ask for." "You sell what men can afford after a year you had a hand in making hard," Clara said, still holding the wood. "But that's between you and them and the good Lord. I've got a fire to tend." She started to walk past him. "You know he can't pay you past the winter," Pierce said to her back, and there was no smile in it now at all. "You do know that. This ranch is done, girl. I've seen the books. I hold the paper on half of it. Caldwell's got one winter maybe before I own this valley from the church to the creek, and no fat woman with a bag of salt is going to change the arithmetic. So you can play at saving him. But I'd think hard on where you'll be come spring, when there's nothing out here left to save, and no one out here left to remember your name." Clara stopped. She stood with her back to him a moment, and then she turned around slow, and the load of oak was steady in her arms, and her face was steady over it. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that Pierce had to still himself to hear it. "I've been told I was nothing my whole life, Mr. Pierce," she said, "by better men than you, and worse. I've been counted out of every room I ever walked into before I got a word out of my mouth, and I'll tell you the one thing all of them had in common, every last one of them who looked at me the way you're looking at me now." She took a step toward him. "They were wrong, every single time. And I've outlasted the whole lot of them, because they spent their strength on judging, and I spent mine on working, and work outlasts judgment. the way the mountain outlasts the weather. Another step. You hold the paper on this ranch. Fine. But you don't hold the winter. Nobody holds the winter. And I've got more say over whether these men eat in January than you and all your paper put together, because I'm the one at the fire, and you're the one in the buggy come out to laugh. She looked at him level. So laugh, sir, and drive home, and we'll see come spring which one of us was arithmetic and which one of us was wrong. The yard had gone dead quiet. The ranch hands had drifted out of the barn to watch drawn by Pierce's buggy, and they stood now in a loose half circle, and not one of them was laughing, and Del Rooney least of all. And in the doorway of the main house stood Ethan Caldwell, and no one had seen him come out, and no one knew how long he'd been standing there. Harold Pierce found his smile again, but it was a poor thing now patched and false. "We'll see," he said. He climbed back into his buggy. "We surely will." He drove off up the road, and the dust hung behind him, and Clara Whitmore turned with her load of oak still steady in her arms, and walked the rest of the way to the smokehouse, as though nothing at all had happened, because to let them see it had cost her anything was a thing she'd trained out of herself years ago. Ethan caught her at the smokehouse door. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and she noticed it and filed it away with the other things she noticed and didn't speak of. "He shouldn't have come out here," Ethan said. "He shouldn't have said any of that to you. He said the truth mostly." She set the oak down inside the door and straightened, and only now with just the two of them did she let a little of the weariness show. "He holds the paper. You've got one winter. He'll own the valley if this place goes under. That's not cruelty, Mr. Caldwell. That's just the situation. He only wrapped it in cruelty because that's the only way a small man knows to carry a big fact." Ethan looked at her, and there was something raw in his face. "You knew," he said. "About the paper, about Pierce. How long you known?" "Since about the third day. It's written all over your books, and all over your face, and all over the way that man drove up here today, like he already owns the road." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I knew what I was walking into, Mr. Caldwell. I told you that the first afternoon and you didn't believe me. I know exactly what's on the table. I've always known. It's the men around me that keep needing to catch up." Ethan Caldwell stood in front of the smokehouse he'd let die, and had watched come back to life in front of the woman the whole county had counted out, who had just backed Harold Pierce down in his own yard, without raising her voice. And he felt something he had not let himself feel in 2 years. Not hope exactly, because hope was a thing that had cost him too much. Something harder and quieter than hope. Something like the first small heat coming back into a building that had been cold a long, long time. "I defended you," he said. "In town, before Pierce came out. I heard him running his mouth about the woman I hired, and I walked into that store and I told him you were hired because you know how to save this ranch, and your work had earned more respect than his opinions ever would." He stopped. "I've never done that. Stood up for anybody in that town. Not in 2 years, maybe not ever." "I know," Clara said softly. "The men told me. It went round the ranch the same day. They watched to see how you'd take Pierce mocking me, and they saw you stand up, and it changed something in how they carry themselves out here. You felt it. The way they help now. The way they wait outside the smokehouse in the mornings to ask what I need." She looked at him. "That wasn't my doing. That was yours. A man stands up once after 2 years of sitting down, and the whole place stands a little straighter. They needed to see it more than I did. Boo!" Ethan didn't have anything to say to that. He stood there a while longer, and then he did the thing he always did. When he'd gotten too near something, he put his hat on, and he stepped back and he made his voice rough. But before he turned to go, he stopped. "That final batch," he said. "The big one. When's it done?" 2 weeks. Little more if the weather holds. Little less if it don't." Clara's face went for the first time, faintly troubled. "It's the one that matters, Mr. Caldwell. The rest is enough to feed 5 men through a soft winter. That batch is the one that feeds 9 through a hard one with enough over to sell for the paper you owe Pierce come spring. It's the whole thing. Everything I've built out here comes down to that batch finishing clean." "And if it don't finish clean?" Clara looked past him out at the sharp gray sky over the mountains. the sky that had been threatening for weeks, and hadn't yet broken the sky she'd been reading every dawn like scripture. "Then Pierce was right about the arithmetic," she said quietly. "And I'll have been wrong for the first time in my life in the one place I couldn't afford it." She turned back to her fire. The oak was stacked, the smoke pulled clean and straight up the old chimney, and on the beams above her hung 2 weeks of the most careful work she had ever done in her life, curing slow, in the low red light, one hard freeze away from either saving a ranch and a man and a winter, or proving every mocking voice she'd ever outlasted right at the very last. She fed the fire, she read the sky, and she settled in to wait for the weather, the way she'd waited for everything her whole life, with her hands busy, her back straight, and her worth held quiet and certain in her own 2 capable hands, whatever the county believed, whatever the sky decided to do. The weather held for 3 days after Pierce drove off, and Clara did not trust a single hour of it. "You keep looking at that sky like it owes you money," Del Rooney said. He'd taken to loitering near the smokehouse now, though he'd have died before admitting he was there to help. "It's the same gray it's been for a week." "It's not." Clara didn't take her eyes off the ridgeline. 3 days back it was gray with weight in the bottom of it. Now the weight's climbing. See how the top's gone flat and hard? That's cold coming down out of Canada to sit on top of the wet that's already here. When those two meet, Mr. Rooney, they don't shake hands, they fight. And we're standing in the field where they'll do it. Del squinted up at the sky and saw she knew nothing at all but gray. "How long?" he said. It was the first time he'd asked her a straight question without a sneer folded into it, and she noticed, and she gave him a straight answer back. 4 days, 5 if we're lucky. The big batch needs 11. She finally looked at him. "You do the arithmetic on that, Mr. Rooney, since you're so fond of your granddaddy's arithmetic." Del did the arithmetic. She watched it land on his face. "That's not enough time," he said slowly. "No, it's not." "So what do you—" "I push the fire hotter, and I watch it every hour of every day and every hour of every night, and I try to take 11 days of curing and do it in 5 without ruining the whole batch by rushing it." Clara turned back to the smokehouse. "That's what I do, and I'll likely not sleep more than an hour at a stretch between now and when that storm breaks, and I'll need somebody hauling wood so I don't have to leave the fire to fetch it myself." She paused at the door. "You volunteering, or you just here to watch a fat woman fail like you've been promising the bunkhouse?" Del Rooney stood in the yard with his ears gone red, and for a long moment Clara thought he'd turn and walk off and go back to being what he'd been. Then he spat in the dirt, hitched his belt, and said, "Where's the wood at?" "Behind the barn. Oak on the left. You bring me the oak, and you don't touch the apple, and if I catch you bringing me pine, I'll put you on the fire in its place." She almost smiled. "Get to it. We're already losing daylight, and daylight's the one thing Pierce can't sell back to us." He went for the wood. And that was the first of them to turn, not with a speech, not with an apology, but with a man's arms full of oak, walking toward a fire he'd sworn would go out. By that evening, there were 3 of them hauling for her, and by the next morning 5, and the change had a shape to it that Clara had seen once or twice in her life, and never stopped marveling at, which was the way a group of men who've decided to laugh at a thing will, when the thing keeps standing quietly, and without discussing it, decide to stand with it instead. Nobody in that bunkhouse announced they'd changed their mind about her. They just started showing up. And the loudest one, Del, showed up loudest of all, barking at the younger hands to stack the oak right and keep the apple clear, and quit letting the door hang open, repeating her rules back at them, word for word, as though he'd invented them. Which was, she'd found exactly how a man made peace with having been wrong by becoming the fiercest defender of the thing he'd mocked. Ethan watched it happen from the main house, and on the second night he came out to the smokehouse and stood in the doorway and said, "You've got half my crew running wood for you. I've got your whole crew running wood for me by tomorrow if this holds." Clara didn't look up from the batch. Her sleeves were pushed to the elbow, and her forearms shone in the firelight, and she hadn't slept but in snatches for 2 days. "They're not doing it for me. Don't make the mistake of thinking they are. They're doing it because they figured out their suppers on those hooks, and a hungry man will help most anybody once he does the arithmetic. You keep saying arithmetic, because it's the only language men out here trust. She turned a hook, checked the color of the meat beneath the salt, moved to the next. Kindness they doubt. Faith they laugh at. But arithmetic, they'll follow into a fire, because arithmetic don't have feelings and can't be accused of going soft. So I speak to them in arithmetic and let them think it was their own good sense. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. You want to help, or you want to keep standing in my doorway blocking my draft? Ethan Caldwell took off his coat. It stopped her. She turned and looked at him, the rancher who'd hired her, the man the whole county called distant, standing in his shirt sleeves in the doorway of a smokehouse he'd let die rolling his cuffs. You don't have to. You said you'll not sleep more than an hour a stretch between now and the storm. He hung his coat on the one good hook by the door. You mean to do that alone in my building over my ranch for my men? And stand there and tell me it's just arithmetic? He crossed to the fire. Tell me what to do, Clara. I've watched you long enough to haul a hook. Tell me the rest. And so she taught him. She taught him the color of good smoke and the color of smoke gone wrong. She taught him where to lay the oak and when to slip in the apple. She taught him to read the meat under the salt with the pad of his thumb, the way her father had taught her. And when his big rancher's hands proved clumsy at it, she took his wrist in her hand and guided it, and for a moment, neither of them breathed, and then she let go, and pretended she hadn't noticed, and he pretended the same, and they went back to the fire. They worked through the night. They worked through the next. And somewhere in those long dark hours between the hauling and the turning and the watching of the smoke, two careful people who'd each spent years holding the world at arm's length forgot for a little while to hold each other at arm's length too. You never married, she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was near 2 a.m. and the fire was low and steady, and the batch was doing what it should, and the quiet had gone soft enough for such things. I did. Ethan fed a length of oak to the coals. I told you. Fever took her. I mean since. No. He watched the wood catch. 2 years and every woman in that town's mother has pointed a daughter at me across the church aisle, and I couldn't. Not because I was still grieving, though folks like that story. Because I looked at every one of them, and I saw somebody who'd looked at me the same way Pierce looks at this ranch as a thing on paper. Widower, good land, bad year, bound to come back around. Arithmetic. He almost smiled. You'd have appreciated it. The whole town's been doing arithmetic on me for 2 years, same as they did on you. Only difference is, theirs came out saying I was worth catching, and yours came out saying you were worth laughing at, and neither one of us was ever asked a single question about who we actually were. Clara stopped turning the hook. That's the truest thing anybody's said to me in a long while, she said quietly. I've had 2 years alone with a dead fire to think it through. She looked at him across the low red light, and there was a thing rising in her chest she had spent her whole life pressing back down, the dangerous thing, the wanting. And she pressed it down now, the way she always had, because she was a woman who'd learned what it cost to want and be counted out in the same breath. Don't, she said. Ethan looked up. Don't what? Whatever you're doing. Sitting out here at 2 a.m. telling me the truest things you've told anybody in 2 years. She kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the meat. I know what happens after Mr. Caldwell. I've watched it happen my whole life. A man gets tired or lonesome or scared. His ranch is dying, and the woman who's near in the hard hours starts to look like something other than what she is. And then the hard hours pass, and the fear lifts, and he gets a good look at her in daylight, with the fear gone, and he remembers what she is. She swallowed. I've been the woman in the hard hours before. I won't be her again. So don't tell me true things at 2 a.m. that you'll wish back at noon. The fire popped. Ethan Caldwell was quiet for a long time. You finished, he said finally. I'm finished. Then I'll say my piece. He set down the oak. I've looked at you in the daylight, Clara. Every day for near 3 weeks. I've watched you back Harold Pierce down in my own yard at high noon with a load of firewood in your arms. I've watched you turn a bunkhouse full of men who came here hating you into a bunkhouse full of men who fight over who gets to haul your oak. That's not the 2 in the morning woman. That's the noon woman. That's who you are when the sun's straight up and there's nowhere to hide, and I've seen her, and she's the finest thing that's walked onto this ranch in a decade. He picked the oak back up. So don't you tell me what I'll wish back. I've done my wishing in daylight. Now turn your batch. Clara turned her batch. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was glad the light was low, and she said nothing at all for a long while, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have said everything, and she was not ready for everything. Not yet. Not with the storm coming, and the whole thing balanced on 11 days squeezed into 5. But she carried what he'd said the way she carried everything worth carrying carefully and told nobody, and least of all told herself how much she wanted to believe it. The 4th day dawned wrong. Clara knew it before she opened her eyes. She'd fallen asleep on a stool by the fire near 4 in the morning and woke at first light to a stillness that was worse than any wind. The dead flat calm that comes before the mountains break their weather open, and she was on her feet and out the smokehouse door before she was fully awake, reading the sky. The top of the gray had gone from flat to churning. Dell! She was already moving toward the bunkhouse. Dell, get up. Get them all up. It's turning. Del Rooney came out, pulling his suspenders up, took one look at her face, and didn't ask a single question. How long? Hours, not days. Hours. She was doing the arithmetic aloud now, fast the way she did when there wasn't time to be quiet about it. The batch has had 4 days. It needs 11. I can't finish it before that storm hits, so I've got to keep this fire alive through the storm, which means I need wood, more wood than we've got, stacked cut and split and stacked dry inside where the snow can't reach it, and I need it in the next 3 hours. And I need the door and the chinking checked, because if the wind finds a gap, it'll suck my heat out and kill the batch in an hour. She grabbed his arm. Can you get me the crew? She grabbed. You'll have every man on this ranch inside the hour. Then go. He went, and Clara turned back to the smokehouse to the 4 days of curing on the beams, and the 7 days of storm between it and finishing, and she felt for the first time since she'd walked out of town, the cold, thin edge of real fear. Not the fear of being laughed at, which she'd made her peace with, but the fear of being right about everything and still losing, which was a fear she had never made her peace with and never would. Ethan found her at the woodpile 20 minutes later, an axe in her hands, splitting oak with a speed and a fury that stopped him in his tracks. Clara, you don't have to. Yes, I do. The axe came down. A round split clean. Every man you've got is on the small stuff. I need the big round split for the long slow burn through the night, and there's not a man out here can read which round holds heat and which one's rotted soft in the middle, and there's no time to teach them, so I'm doing it myself. Another round, another clean split. You want to help get behind me and stack what I split tight under the lean-to where it stays dry. Go. He went behind her and stacked. They worked like that for 2 hours. The whole ranch turned to it, 9 men and 1 woman moving wood against a sky that darkened by the minute. And it was Del Rooney who first felt the wind change, who stopped dead in the yard with a round of oak in his arms and said, "It's here." And it was here the first breath of it coming down cold and mean off the mountain, and behind that first breath, Clara knew, came all the rest. "Inside," she called. "Everything dry and inside, now." They got it in. They got the last of it in, and Clara did a fast, hard circle of the smokehouse with a lantern and a fistful of rags, jamming the chinking where the old logs had shrunk. Checking the door. And she found what she'd feared she'd find, which was that the crooked door that had hung loose on its hinge for 2 years did not seal, would not seal, left a gap the width of 2 fingers along the bottom where the cold would pour in like water, and there was no time to rehang a door, no time at all. Ethan. She never called him that. She called him that now. The door won't seal, bottom gap. The cold'll find it the second the wind's up and it'll kill the fire's work. I need something to close it, and I need it now. Ethan Caldwell looked at the gap. He looked at the storm coming down the mountain. And then he did a thing that Clara would carry with her the rest of her days. He took off his coat. The good heavy ranch coat. The one thing a man out here truly needed against a winter like the one bearing down, and he knelt in the doorway and jammed it into the gap along the bottom of the door, packing it tight, sealing the cold out with the coat off his own back. "You'll freeze," Clara said. "I've got a house. The batch don't." He stood in his shirt sleeves in the first spits of snow. "Feed your fire, Clara. I'll see to the men." And then the storm hit in full, and the world outside the smokehouse disappeared into white and howling. And Clara Whitmore was alone with her fire, and her 4 days of curing, and 7 days of storm to hold it through. And she settled onto her stool, and she fed the oak, and she began the longest night of her life. The men couldn't reach her. That was the thing nobody had counted on. By the second hour of the storm, the wind was strong enough that a man crossing the yard from the bunkhouse to the smokehouse risked being turned around and lost 20 feet from a building he'd walked to 10,000 times. And Ethan had made the hard call and ordered every hand to stay put where they were because he'd not lose a man to save a batch of pork, and so Clara was cut off. Alone. One woman, one fire, one door sealed with a rancher's coat, against a storm that had come a week early to prove Harold Pierce's arithmetic right. She talked to the fire to stay awake. "You'll hold?" she told it, feeding oak. "You've come too far to go out now. We both have." Hours passed. The wind screamed at the door and found the coat and could not get past it. "My daddy held a fire through a storm worse than this, once in Wyoming when I was 9. 2 nights and a day. Whole valley lost their winter meat but us." And you know what he said after? She fed the fire. He said, "Clara girl, the storm don't beat you. The sleep beats you. The storm's got no patience. It spends itself and it's gone. But the sleep waits, and it whispers and it tells you you've done enough. You can close your eyes just a minute, the fire'll keep." And that's the lie that costs a man his winter. So you don't listen to the sleep. You listen to the fire. And the fire never once told me to rest. She did not rest. Through the first night she did not rest, and through the gray roaring dawn that was hardly a dawn at all, and through the second day, feeding oak and reading smoke, and pressing her thumb to the meat under the salt. And somewhere in the second night, the sleep came for her, exactly as her father had promised, whispering that she'd done enough, that the fire would keep, that she could close her eyes just a minute. And she caught herself sliding off the stool, with her eyes already shut, and hauled herself back, and slapped her own face hard enough to sting, and stood up and walked the small circle of the smokehouse to wake her legs, and she did not close her eyes. And outside in the main house, Ethan Caldwell stood at the window, looking at a wall of white, where his smokehouse should have been, and could not see it, could not reach it, could do nothing but stand there in his shirt sleeves and know that the finest thing that had walked onto his ranch in a decade was out in that white alone, and that if the fire went out, it would not only be the winter meat that died in there. "She'll be all right," Dell said behind him. The younger man had appeared at his shoulder. "She's tougher than the storm." "Nobody's tougher than the storm." Ethan didn't turn from the window. "The storm doesn't get tired, she does." "Then why'd you let her?" "I didn't let her do anything." Now he turned, and there was something in his face Dell had never seen on him. A rawness that stopped the younger man cold. "You don't let Clara Whitmore do anything. You try to stand in front of her and she goes around you. She was out at that woodpile with an axe before I got my boots on. She sealed that door with my coat before I thought to offer it." He turned back to the white window. "All I've ever done for that woman is try to keep up with her. And now I can't even do that. Now she's out there, and I'm in here, and there's a wall of snow between us, thick as a lie, and all I can do is stand at this window and count the hours, and hope the sleep doesn't take her before the storm spends itself." Dell was quiet a moment. "You love her," he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan Caldwell didn't answer. He didn't have to. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. It didn't taper. It simply spent itself the way the worst ones do, the wind falling off between 1 hour and the next, until the sudden stillness was louder than the storm had been, and the white lifted, and there was the ranch again, buried to the fence tops, blinding under a low, hard sun. And there was the smokehouse, standing smoke rising from its chimney thin and clean and straight up into the still cold air. Ethan was out the door before anyone could stop him, breaking a path through the drifts with his whole body falling and rising and falling and driving forward. And the men came behind him, and it was 100 feet that took 10 minutes. And when he reached the smokehouse door, he tore his frozen coat out of the gap where it had held all through the storm, and he wrenched the crooked door open. The heat rolled out. The fire was alive, low and red and steady, and above it, on every beam, hung the whole batch, the 11-day batch, given 5 days, and then held for 3 through a killing storm, cured clean and dark and perfect. More winter meat than the Caldwell Ranch had seen in 3 years. Enough to feed 9 men through the hardest winter, with enough left over to sell for the paper Pierce held. And on the floor beside the fire, sitting up against the salt box with a length of oak still in her hand, her head fallen sideways and her eyes shut, at last was Clara Whitmore. For one terrible heartbeat, Ethan thought the sleep had taken her after all, worse than sleep. And he was across the floor and on his knees beside her, with her name in his mouth like a prayer. Clara, Clara. Her eyes opened. They found his face and took a moment to focus, and then a slow, exhausted smile spread across her round, tired features, and she looked past him at the beams full of cured meat, and she said in a voice worn down to a whisper by 3 days of talking to a fire, "Told you I could save your winter." Ethan Caldwell knelt on the floor of his own smokehouse and laughed a broken, disbelieving, joyful sound the men behind him had never heard him make, and behind him Del Rooney let out a whoop that started the whole crew hollering, 9 grown ranch hands cheering in the snow for the fat woman they'd come to laugh at. And Clara Whitmore sat against the salt box with the oak still in her hand and let herself for once be cheered. She'd earned it. She had earned every voice of it. They carried the meat to the main house cellar over the next 2 days, and they treated Clara like something between a queen and a saint. And Del Rooney would not let her lift so much as a single ham-standing guard over her recovery, with the fierce devotion of a man making up for weeks of being wrong all at once. "You sit," he told her when she reached for a load. "You cured it. We'll carry it. That's the arithmetic." Clara let him carry it. She was too tired to fight him, and there was a sweetness in being fussed over that she'd not felt since her father died, and she let herself have it. And she watched the cellar fill with the winter she'd saved, and she thought for the first time in a long while that she might have found not just work, but a place. She should have known better. She'd told Ethan herself that first night a person's worth was never decided by what others saw first, but she'd forgotten to finish the thought, which was that the world rarely lets a person keep a place they've earned without first trying to take it back. And the world in the person of Harold Pierce was not finished with the Caldwell Ranch. He came on the 5th day after the storm, when the roads were clear enough for a buggy, and this time he did not come to laugh. He came with a paper. Clara was in the yard when his buggy came up the road strong again after 5 days of real food and real sleep, and she felt the old familiar landing of his eyes and stood her ground under it. And Ethan came out of the house to meet him, and the men drifted out of the barn, and there was a stillness over the whole ranch that had a different quality than the last time, because the last time Pierce had come to mock, and this time everyone could see he'd come to strike. Caldwell. Pierce climbed down. He did not look at Clara. He'd learned that much. "I'll not waste your morning. You've had a good run of luck, and I'm pleased for you truly, but luck and paper are 2 different animals, and I hold the paper." He drew a folded document from his coat. "The note on the North 40 and the water rights. Due in full. I'm calling it." The yard went silent. "It's not due till spring," Ethan said. His voice was very level. "You know it's not due till spring." "I know the terms of a note I wrote," Pierce said pleasantly, better than a man who signed it in a bad year without reading it close. "There's a clause. In the event of default on the seasonal interest which came due the 1st of this month, Caldwell during your storm, and which you did not pay the full note, may be called at the holder's discretion." He smiled. "It's my discretion. I'm calling it." Clara watched Ethan Caldwell's face go gray. "The interest," Ethan said slowly. "That was $30. $30 I'd have paid you any day, Pierce, you know I would. I was buried under 6 feet of snow keeping my men alive. And I sympathize. I do. Pierce refolded the paper. But the note doesn't sympathize. The note says default. And default says, the wholesome or the North 40 and the water rights come to me. You've got the water rights, this valley's got water. You lose them. He let it hang. Well, a ranch without water in it isn't a ranch. It's just a lot of dry ground. I'll buy cheap at auction come spring, along with the rest of it. He climbed back into his buggy. You've got until Friday. Full sum, or the rights. I'll want your answer at the store. He gathered the reins. Do give my regards to your cook. And he drove off, leaving the paper's terms hanging over the ranch like the storm had hung over it a week before, and this time there was no fire. Clara could tend to hold it back, because this was not weather. This was arithmetic. The real kind, the cruel kind, the kind Pierce had promised her from the start would beat any fat woman with a bag of salt in the end. The yard didn't move for a long moment. Then Ethan Caldwell turned, and his face was the face of a man who has just watched 2 years of clawing back from ruin undone by a $30 clause and a storm. And he looked at Clara, and there was in his eyes an apology and a defeat that struck her harder than anything Pierce had said. How much? Clara said. The full sum. How much to clear it? $400. Ethan's voice was hollow. I've got maybe 60 to my name, and a cellar full of meat I can't turn to cash till the spring buyers come through, and they don't come through till April, and Friday is in 4 days. He laughed a terrible sound with no humor in it. He timed it. The whole thing. He waited 2 years for the one clause I'd trip on, and he called it the week I couldn't pay it, and can't sell my way out of it. You said it yourself, Clara. That first night he only wraps the cruelty around a big fact. Well, here's the fact. $400 by Friday, or he takes the water, and without the water, he takes the rest. Come spring meat, or no meat fire, or no fire. He put his hat on. You saved my winter. I'll not pretend you didn't. But there's some arithmetic even you can't outwork, and Harold Pierce just wrote it on a piece of paper and drove it up my road. He walked toward the house, and Clara Whitmore stood in the yard with the whole crew watching her. The men who'd cheered her 5 days before now looking at her, the way men look at the one person who's beaten the odds before and might impossibly know how to do it again. And she looked at the road where Pierce's dust still hung, and she felt something harden in her that was older than the ranch, and older than Ethan, and older than the storm. She'd been counted out before. She'd been counted out her whole life. And she had a thing Harold Pierce, for all his paper, did not have and could not buy, and had never once in his soft, well-fed life been forced to learn. She knew how to work when the arithmetic said stop. Dell, she said. Dell Rooney was at her side in an instant. Ma'am. That meat in the cellar, the overage, the part past what feeds the 9 of us through winter. How much is it in your best guess? Dell frowned. Reckon near half of its overage. Ethan cured it. You cured it, figuring to sell come spring. 200 pound of good smoked pork, maybe more. Why? Because Ethan says the spring buyers don't come till April. Clara's eyes were on the road, but her mind was moving faster than it had moved at the woodpile, faster than it had moved through the storm. But the spring buyers aren't the only people in this country who eat pork, Mr. Rooney. And a man who holds the whole valley's paper has made himself a whole valley's worth of enemies. And enemies talk, and I've been listening since the day I got here, same as I listen to everything. She turned to him. How far to the mining camps up the pass? Dell blinked. The camps, day and a half maybe if the pass is clear, but the pass won't be clear, not after that storm, not for... Then we don't take the pass. Clara was already walking toward the barn. Get me a map. Get me whoever on this crew knows the low country south of the river. And don't say a word of this to Ethan yet, not one word, because that man is about to spend the next 4 days grieving a ranch that isn't lost, and I'll not have him talk me out of the one thing left to try before I've even tried it. Del Rooney stood in the yard a moment watching her go, and then a slow grin broke across his face, the grin of a man who has learned finally and completely not to bet against Clara Whitmore. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went for the map. Because there was a thing Harold Pierce in all his arithmetic had failed to carry, that the woman he kept calling the cook had spent her entire life being handed lost causes and impossible odds, and told kindly and cruelly, and every way in between, that she'd never make it, and that every single time she had. And she was not about to start losing now. The map came, and with it, a lean, quiet older hand, named Amos Freed, who'd trapped the low country south of the river in his younger days, and knew every draw and crossing between the Caldwell Ranch and the mining camps up on the far side of the pass. Clara spread the map on the barn floor, and knelt over it with a lantern, and Amos knelt beside her, and Del hung over the both of them, and for an hour the three of them plotted a route that no buyer's wagon had ever taken, because no buyer had ever been desperate enough to take it. Here. Amos laid a weathered finger on the map. "You can't take the pass that's death this time of year, but you don't need the pass. You drop south along the river bottom here, where the wind keeps the snow thin, and you cross at the old ford below the falls. From there, it's up the back draw to the camps. It's rough, it's slow, but it's passable with a light wagon and a strong team, and it comes out right above the biggest camp on the mountain, where there's 400 hungry miners been eating beans and saltfish since October and would pay $1 a pound for good smoked pork and count themselves lucky." $1 a pound. Clara did the arithmetic fast. 200 pound of overage, that's $200. "Half of what you need," Del said. "Half of what we need." Clara sat back on her heels. "And the other half?" Amos and Del looked at each other. "There's the second camp," Amos said slowly. "Smaller. Another half day on. But the second camp's got the company store, and the company store's run by a man near as bad as Pierce. And he won't let a private cellar near his miners if he can help it, and the first camp's 400 men will have told the whole mountain that there's smoked pork for sale by the time we get there," Clara finished. "So we don't go to the second camp. We let the second camp come to us. We sell the first 200 pound at the first camp for $200, and word runs down the mountain the way word does. And we sit at that first camp one extra day, and sell whatever the ranch can spare, beyond the overage, because Ethan cured enough to feed 9 men through a soft winter, and after that storm, gentlemen, we're not having a soft winter, we're having a short, hungry one. But we'll have a short, hungry one that's alive on a ranch we still own. And a short, hungry winter on your own land beats a full belly working Harold Pierce's ground come spring." She looked up at them. "Am I wrong?" The two men were quiet. "You'd sell your own winter down to the bone?" Amos said finally, to keep this man his water. "I'd sell it down past the bone." Clara rolled up the map. "Because I've been hungry before, Mr. Freed, and I've been landless before, and I'll tell you which one you don't come back from. A hungry winter ends in the spring. A landless one just goes on." She stood. "Ethan Caldwell gave me a key to a dead building and let me be somebody on this ranch when the whole county said I was nobody. I'll not stand in his yard and watch a soft man with a paper take the ground out from under him over $30 and a storm. Not while I've got 200 pound of pork and a wagon and 2 men fool enough to drive it over the falls ford with me." She looked between them. "You in, or do I drive it alone?" Del Rooney stepped forward before she'd finished the sentence. "You're not driving anything alone," he said. "Not ever again. I stood in a warm house and let you hold that fire through the storm by yourself, and I'll not stand in a warm barn and let you drive that wagon over the mountain by yourself. I'm in. To the falls ford and past it and back." "Amos!" The old trapper folded the map slow, and there was a light in his weathered face that hadn't been there in years. "I ain't crossed the falls ford in 20 years, he said. "Reckon it's about time I did it once more before I'm too old to." He tucked the map inside his coat. "I'm in. But we go before dawn, and we go before Ethan wakes, because that man'll try to stop us out of pride, and pride's a luxury a ranch $400 in the hole can't afford." "Before dawn," Clara agreed. And that was the plan. A fat woman, a reformed loudmouth, and an old trapper driving a light wagon loaded with a ranch's whole winter of saved meat over a river ford. Below a frozen falls in the dead of the coldest week of the year, to sell it to 400 hungry miners for the $400 that stood between Ethan Caldwell and losing everything. It was madness. It was in Harold Pierce's arithmetic impossible, which was precisely why Clara Whitmore intended to do it. They loaded the wagon by lantern light in the black cold hours before dawn, moving quiet, and Clara had just settled the last of the pork under the canvas when a voice came from the barn door. "Going somewhere?" Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway with a lantern in his hand, and his coat on the storm-stiffened coat dried out now, but never the same, and his face was not angry. That was the thing that near undid her. It was not angry. It was afraid. "Ethan, you loaded my whole cellar onto a wagon in the dark." He came into the barn slow. "The winter meat. The meat you near died to cure. And you did it quiet before light so I'd not wake to stop you." He stopped in front of her. "I'll ask you once more, Clara. Where are you going with my winter?" And Clara Whitmore looked at the man who'd handed her a rusted key and let her be somebody, and she made a choice she'd been making her whole life to tell the truth, plain, whatever it cost. "I'm going to sell it," she said. "The overage and then some. Over the falls forward to the mining camps where 400 hungry men will pay $1 a pound for good smoked pork. I'll come back with $400, and you'll clear Pierce's note on Friday, and you'll keep your water and your ground." She held his eyes. "And yes, I did it quiet because I knew you'd try to stop me out of pride, and I love this ranch too much now to let your pride lose it. So there's the truth, Ethan. All of it. You can stand in that doorway and forbid it, and I'll unload every pound and let Pierce take your water come Friday, and we'll both know you chose your pride over your ground. Or you can step aside and let a fat woman and two good men do the one impossible thing that's left the way she's done, every impossible thing that was ever handed her." She lifted her chin. "Which is it going to be, Mr. Caldwell?" The barn was dead silent. Dell and Amos stood by the wagon and did not breathe. And Ethan Caldwell looked at the wagon, and at the two men, and at the woman who had walked out of town 3 weeks ago, and lit a dead fire, and turned his crew, and backed down Pierce, and held a batch through a killing storm, and was now in the black hours before dawn, proposing to drive his last hope over a frozen river to save the ground he'd already given up for lost. And he set down his lantern, and he climbed up into the wagon. "Not without me," he said. "You want to do the impossible thing, Clara Whitmore, you'll not do it without me. I've spent 3 weeks trying to keep up with you, and I'm not stopping now." He took up the reins and looked down at her, and his afraid face had gone to something else. Something steadier and warmer. The thing he'd been circling for 3 weeks and finally in a cold barn before dawn let land. "Get up here beside me. Amos knows the ford. Dell rides drag. And you," his voice caught, just slightly. "You sit up front where I can see you so I know you're real, and so I can tell you the whole way there the thing I should have told you at 2 in the morning that first night instead of arguing with you about daylight." Clara Whitmore climbed up beside him. Amos took the lead. Dell mounted his horse, and the wagon rolled out of the barn into the black killing cold, loaded with a ranch's whole saved winter, bound for a frozen ford. Below a falls and 400 hungry men, and the $400 that stood between a good man and ruin. Driven by the two people the whole county had counted out side by side on the bench into the dark, with the whole impossible thing still ahead of them and the outcome known to no one, least of all to Harold Pierce, sleeping soft and certain in town, with his paper folded in his coat, and his arithmetic that had never once in all his soft, well-fed life had to reckon with Clara Whitmore. The wagon rolled south along the river bottom, where the wind kept the snow thin, and the falls forward waited in the dark ahead, frozen and roaring, and one wrong wheel from swallowing the whole of it whole. They had gone maybe 2 hours when Amos reined up hard at the front and lifted a fist, and the whole train stopped in the dark. "What is it?" Ethan said low. "Listen." They listened. And under the small sounds of the horses and the creak of the wagon, there was a sound Clara felt in her chest, before she heard it in her ears, a deep, steady roar that never rose and never fell. The sound of a great deal of water moving fast and cold in the dark somewhere ahead of them. "That's the falls," Amos said. "Ford's just below it. We're closer than I reckoned. Wind must have pushed us." He turned in his saddle. "Now hear me all of you, because I'll only say it once, and the water's loud. The ford's 40 feet of shallow crossing over flat rock. In summer, it's ankle deep, and a child could walk it. But that storm melted and froze and melted again, and there's ice on that rock. Now sheet ice under running water, and a horse that panics on ice is a horse that goes down, and a horse that goes down in that current don't come up. So we cross slow. We cross one at a time. And nobody hurries on that rock, no matter what they hear or see. You understand me?" "We understand," Ethan said. "Clara, I understand Mr. Freed." "Then let's go look at it in the light. It'll be dawn by the time we reach the bank, and I'll not cross that ford blind for all the pork on the mountain." They came to the bank as the first gray light was bleeding up behind the peaks, and Clara got her first look at the thing they meant to cross, and she understood at last why Amos had made them wait for the light. The river came down out of the falls white and furious, and then spread wide and flat over a shelf of rock, and the crossing was there just as he'd said. 40 feet of shallow water running fast over stone, and even in the gray light she could see the ice on it, the treacherous glassy sheen where the spray had frozen and the current ran over the top of it. "Lord," Dell said quietly. "He won't help you cross it," Amos said. "But your own 2 hands and a cool head will. I'll take the lead horse across first on foot, walking him, testing every step. When I'm across and I signal, Ethan brings the wagon slow, and Clara, you'll walk beside the team on the downstream side, on foot with a hand on the harness, because if a horse starts to slide, you want weight and a voice on the downstream side to steady him, and you're the coolest head here. After me. Don't argue it. I've watched you 2 hours, and I know a cool head when I see one. Dell rides last, and Dell, you keep your horse well back till the wagon's clear, because one animal on that rock at a time, and not a hoof more." Nobody argued. Amos swung down, took the lead horse's bridle in his fist, and stepped out onto the ice. Clara had never in her life watched anything the way she watched that old man cross that ford. He went a step at a time, setting each boot down flat and testing it before he put his weight on it, murmuring to the horse in a low, steady voice she couldn't hear over the water, and the horse followed him with its ears pinned and its eyes rolling white, and twice the animal balked, and twice Amos stood stock still in the middle of the roaring water and waited it out, and the whole of it took 10 minutes that felt like an hour. And then he was on the far bank, and the horse was up beside him, and he turned and lifted his arm. "Now us," Ethan said. He clucked the team forward, and Clara swung down off the bench and came around to the downstream side and got her hand on the harness, and they started out onto the ice. The cold of the water came through her boots in the first step, and she ignored it. The rock was slick as glass under the running water, and she set each foot the way she'd watched Amos set his flat in testing, and she kept her hand on the harness and her voice low and steady in the near horse's ear. "Easy," she said. "Easy now. 1 foot and then the next. That's the whole of it. 1 foot and then the next." They were halfway across when the near horse's hind hoof slid. It happened in an instant. The animal's leg shot out from under it, and it lurched sideways downstream toward Clara, its whole 1,000 pounds of panicking weight tipping into the current, and Ethan hauled back on the reins and shouted, and the wagon slewed on the ice, and for one endless heartbeat, the whole enterprise hung on the edge of going into the river, meat and wagon and horse and woman, all of it. $400 and a ranch, and every impossible thing they'd come to do about to vanish under the white water below the falls. And Clara Whitmore did not let go. She threw her whole weight, all 150 kilograms of the body the county had spent her whole life laughing at, against the horse's shoulder downstream, a counterweight the animal could feel. And she put her mouth to its ear, and she did not scream. She said low and hard and certain, "No, not today. You get your feet under you, you hear me, you get them under you." And the horse, feeling the weight and hearing the voice, stopped fighting the slide and got its feet under it. 1 hoof and then the next flat on the ice, and it steadied. The wagon stopped slewing. The whole train stood dead still in the middle of the roaring ford, and for a moment nobody breathed, and then Amos's voice came across the water, tight as a wire. "Walk him on, Clara, slow. Don't stop now. Whatever you do, don't stop on the ice. Walk him on." She walked him on. Her legs were shaking, and the cold water had filled her boots, and her heart was going like the falls itself. But she kept her hand on the harness, and her voice in the horse's ear, and she walked him the last 20 feet of that ford, one flat testing step at a time. And then the wagon wheels bit gravel, and they were up the far bank and onto solid frozen ground, and Ethan set the brake and was down off the bench and had her by both shoulders before she'd got her breath. "You could have gone in." His voice was ragged. "You threw yourself against a falling horse over a river that would have killed you, Clara. You could have gone in. But I didn't." She was still breathing hard. "And the horse didn't. And your winter didn't. That's the arithmetic that matters, Ethan." She looked up at him, and there was something wild and alive in her face that hadn't been there in 3 weeks of careful work. "We're across. We're across the Falls Ford. Harold Pierce is sleeping soft in town, thinking that's impossible, and we just did it before breakfast." A laugh broke out of her disbelieving. "We did it." And Ethan Caldwell, standing on the frozen far bank with the river roaring behind him, and the woman he loved shaking and laughing in his hands, did a thing he had not done in 2 years and had not planned to do now. He kissed her. It was cold and quick and clumsy. The kiss of a man who'd forgotten how, and Clara went still against him, and Amos looked very hard at the horses, and Dell grinned at the sky, and when Ethan pulled back, his face was stricken with his own boldness. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have you told me not to. The daylight, the 2 in the morning, Ethan." "I know you said Ethan Caldwell." Clara put her cold hand against his cold face. "It's near dawn. The sun's coming up over that mountain right now, straight up, nowhere to hide. This is the daylight I was talking about." She looked at him steady. "And you kissed me in it anyway. So I reckon you meant it after all." He looked at her. "I meant it," he said. "God help me, I've never meant anything more." "Then that's settled," Clara said, and she stepped back, and she was all business again, but there was color in her face now that the cold hadn't put there. "And we'll settle the rest of it after we've settled with Pierce, because there's 400 hungry miners up that draw, and $400 to make, and a note due Friday, and I'll not marry a landless man, Ethan Caldwell. So let's go make sure you keep your ground." She turned toward the wagon. "Dell, get your horse across, careful as Amos showed you. We've got a mountain to climb and half a day to climb it. Daylight's burning." Dell brought his horse across the ford, grinning like a fool, and Amos shook his head at the pair of them, and they loaded up and turned the wagon up the back draw toward the camps. And behind them, the Falls Ford roared on. The impossible thing they'd already done. The first of the impossible things that day would ask of them. The draw was steep and slow, and it took them the whole of the morning and half the afternoon, and Clara sat up front beside Ethan and did the arithmetic over and over in her head, the way she always did, checking it and checking it again, because a plan that hung on $1 a pound only worked if the miners had the dollar and the appetite both. "You're worrying it," Ethan said. "I can hear you doing sums. I'm making sure the sums still add." Clara watched the draw climb ahead of them. 200 pound of overage at $1 a pound is $200. That's the safe part. That's the part I'd bet my life on. The other 200 I need to come out of selling down our own winter store, which means every pound I sell up here is a pound off our own table come January. And I need to sell exactly enough to clear the note, and not 1 pound past it, because past it, and I've starved the ranch to save it, and that's no rescue at all. She frowned. "It's a knife's edge, Ethan. 200 I'm sure of, and 200 I've got to cut so fine that if the price is a nickel low or the appetite a hair small, we come home short and short's the same as nothing. Pierce doesn't take 390 and call it good. It's 400 whole, or it's the water." "So we make it 400 whole. So we make it 400 whole?" She agreed. "Which means I can't just sell to them. I've got to sell to them right. I've got to make 400 men who've been eating beans since October understand that they're not buying pork, they're buying Christmas. and Christmas is worth $1 a pound and not a penny of haggling." She set her jaw. "I can do it. I've talked harder rooms into believing me than a camp full of hungry miners. But it's got to be done right, and it's got to be done the minute we roll in before the company storeman hears we're there and finds a reason to run us off." "You've got this figured to the minute." "I've had it figured to the minute since Pierce drove off." Clara looked at him. "That's the difference between us and him, Ethan. He figures the odds and quits when they're bad. I figure the odds, and then I figure how to beat them, because I've never once in my life had good odds. So if I quit when the odds were bad, I'd have quit before I was born. Bad odds are just the weather to me. You don't quit on account of the weather. You dress for it, and you go." They came up out of the draw in the middle of the afternoon, and the camp opened up in front of them, and it was rougher and bigger and hungrier looking than Clara had let herself imagine. A sprawl of tents and shacks clinging to the mountainside with smoke rising from 100 fires, and men everywhere. Gaunt, hard men in worn coats, moving between the diggings and the shacks, and Clara felt the eyes of the whole camp turn toward the wagon. The way eyes always turned toward her, except this time it wasn't her size they were reading. It was the wagon, and the smell. Because the cold air had gotten into the canvas and pulled the smell of the smoked pork out over the whole camp, and 400 men who had been eating beans and salt fish since October lifted their heads at once like deer catching a scent. "There," Clara said quietly. "There's my room, Ethan. 400 hungry men and one wagon of Christmas. Set the brake and let me work." Ethan set the brake, and Clara Whitmore stood up on the wagon bench, all of her, the whole body the county had laughed at her whole life, and she lifted her voice over the camp, the way she'd lifted it over Harold Pierce in the yard, clear and warm and carrying. And she said, "Gentlemen, I've come a long way over a hard road, and I've brought something with me that I reckon not one of you has tasted since you left home. Smoked pork. Hickory and applewood cured slow and cured right, the kind your mother made, the kind you've been dreaming about since the beans ran out in October." She let the smell do half the work. "It's $1 a pound. And before any man among you tells me that's dear, I'll tell you what it is. It's the taste of a table you're not sitting at this winter, and there's no deer on that. So, who's first? Who wants to remember what supper used to taste like?" For one heartbeat, nobody moved. And then a big bearded man near the front dug into his coat and came up with a fistful of coin and said, "I'll take £2, ma'am, and God bless you for coming up that draw." And behind him, the whole camp broke and surged toward the wagon, and Clara Whitmore was in business. She sold for 2 hours. Dell cut and weighed, and Ethan took the coin, and Amos stood guard over the wagon bed, and Clara worked the crowd the whole time, calling out to them, laughing with them, telling one man his mother would be proud. He was eating decent again. And another, that a pound wouldn't do, a man his size needed 2. And the coin came in, and the meat went out, and she watched the pile of overage shrink, and the coin in Ethan's box grow, and she kept the running sum in her head the whole while exact, to the dollar. They sold the 200-pound of overage in the first hour and a half, and the box held $206, and Clara did not stop. She had told Ethan she'd have to cut into their own winter store fine to the pound, and now she did it, and it was the hardest selling she'd ever done, because every pound past the overage was a pound off her own table in January, and she felt each one go. But she sold it calling the price, holding the line at $1, refusing every haggle with a smile, because she'd told Ethan the truth in the draw. 400 whole, or it was the water, and she'd not come this far to come home with 390. She was at $370, and the winter store was down to what she'd judged was the last safe pound to sell before she'd be starving the ranch when the company's storeman came. He came shoving through the crowd with 2 big men behind him. A soft, heavy man in a good coat with a face gone red with fury, and Clara knew the type before he opened his mouth because she'd just spent a week learning it in Harold Pierce. "That's enough." He planted himself in front of the wagon. "This is company ground, and that's company men you're selling to, and there's no peddling allowed on company ground, so pack up your wagon and get off this mountain before I have you thrown off it." The crowd went quiet and sullen, And Clara Whitmore looked down at him from the wagon bench, and she was $30 short of saving a ranch, and she was tired to the bone, and she had crossed a frozen ford and climbed a mountain, and she was in no mood at all. "There's no peddling allowed," she repeated. "By whose say? By the company's say. My say. I run the store here." "You run the store?" Clara nodded slowly. "And the store sells beans and salt fish, and has since October. And these men are sick to death of it, and you're not angry that I'm peddling on company ground, sir. You're angry that I've got something the men want, and you don't, and you can't stand to watch their coin go to a wagon instead of your shelves." She raised her voice so the whole camp heard it. "That's the whole of it, isn't it? You'd let these men eat beans till spring, before you'd let a nickel of their pay go past your store. Well, I'll tell you what I told a man just like you back down the mountain not 1 week ago." She leaned forward. "You don't hold the winter. Nobody holds the winter. And you surely don't hold these men's right to spend their own hard-dug pay on a decent supper if they've a mind to." The camp made a low sound of agreement, and the storeman's face went redder, and his 2 big men shifted, and for a moment it stood on a knife's edge, and Ethan's hand had gone quiet and ready near his coat, and Clara saw it and knew this could go badly. Bad $370 and a ranch, and all of them a long, hard road from home in the middle of a camp full of the storeman's muscle. And then the big bearded miner who'd bought first stepped up beside the wagon. "She stays," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was a head taller than the storeman, and there was coal dust ground into the lines of his hands. "First decent food this camp's seen since the snow, and you want to run her off to protect your bean money. She stays till her wagon's empty. Any man here disagree? Not a man in 400 disagreed." The storeman looked at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at him. 400 hard, hungry men who'd been eating his beans on his credit at his prices since October. And he did the only arithmetic a man like that ever understands, which was that he was one soft man with 2 hired hands in a camp of 400 who'd just found something to be angry about, and he swallowed it. "Empty your wagon and be gone by dark," he said thickly, and he turned and shoved back through the crowd the way he'd come, and the camp let out a rough cheer, and Clara Whitmore let out a breath she'd been holding and looked at the big bearded miner with something close to love. "I don't know your name, sir," she said, "but I'll not forget it." "Cole," he said. "And I'll tell you what, ma'am, you sell me the last of what's in that wagon, whatever's left, and I'll split it with the men who backed you, and you go home with your box full, because I heard you working this crowd, and I heard you say 400 whole, and I'd bet my beard there's a reason for that number." He looked up at her. "Some fella down the mountain got a paper on you." Clara stared at him. "On a good man," she said. "Not on me. Note due Friday. $400 or he takes the water off a ranch this woman near died to save the winter of." Cole nodded slow, and he turned to the crowd, and he lifted his voice the way she'd lifted hers. "Boys," he called. "This lady drove a wagon of decent food over the Falls Ford and up the back draw in the dead of winter, and she did it because some paper-holding buzzard down the valley's fixing to take a good man's water this Friday over a debt. Now most of us up here left a ranch or a farm or a homestead behind us that some buzzard just like him took while we were off digging his coal. So I'm buying the last of this wagon, and I'm calling it even, but any man's got $1 to spare and a memory of what it feels like to lose ground to a man in a good coat. You come put it in that box, and you call it a blow struck for every one of us that never got to strike one." And Clara Whitmore sat on the wagon bench and watched 400 hard, hungry miners line up not to buy, but to give $1 here. 50 cents there a man with nothing, pressing a dime into Ethan's box and touching his hat and moving on. And she watched the sum climb past 400, past 450, past 500. And she put her face in her hands. This woman who never wept, who'd trained the weeping out of herself decades ago. And she wept, because she'd come up the mountain figuring on beating bad odds by working the way she always had alone on the strength of her own 2 hands. And instead, a camp full of men who'd all been beaten by the same kind of buzzard had looked at her fight and made it theirs. "That's $512, Ethan said low beside her. His own voice wasn't steady. "Clara, it's $512. It's the note and 100 over. It's more than the note." Clara wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand. "It's the note, and it's seed for spring. And it's the winter store I sold bought back double." She looked out at the camp at Cole, at the 400 men drifting back to their diggings with decent food in their hands for the first time since October. "Ethan, it's not just your ranch anymore. Every man in this camp just bought a piece of beating Harold Pierce. We can't lose now. We can't. We'd be losing it for all of them. We won't lose." Ethan closed the box. "We'll be down the mountain by tomorrow night and at Pierce's store Thursday, a day early, with his $400 counted out on his own counter, and I'll watch his face while I do it." He looked at her, and there was a fierce joy in him she'd never seen. "You did this. You know that. 3 weeks ago, I was a beaten man with a dead smokehouse, and you walked up my road and lit the fire, and turned my crew, and crossed a ford that would have killed a lesser soul, and stood up on a wagon in front of 400 strangers and talked them into saving my life. And you did it because I gave you a rusted key." He shook his head. "Cheapest thing I ever did. Handed you a key I figured opened nothing, and it opened everything." "It always was worth something," Clara said quietly. "The smokehouse. You just couldn't see it, same as they couldn't see me. That's the whole lesson of the thing, Ethan, if there's a lesson. The value was never in what you saw first. It was in what was there all along, waiting for somebody to bother to look." She squeezed his hand. "Now let's get off this mountain and go show Harold Pierce what he couldn't be bothered to look at." They made camp that night in the shelter of the draw, and they were down and across the Falls Ford. By noon the next day, easier this time. The ice gone soft in a warm spell, Amos leading them over, sure and slow, and they rolled back onto Caldwell ground as the light was going on. Wednesday evening, a full day ahead of Pierce's Friday, with a strong box holding $512 and a ranch full of hands who'd given them up for lost pouring out of the bunkhouse to meet them. And it should have been triumph whole and clean. But there was a rider waiting in the yard. He sat a good horse and wore town clothes, and he had the look of a man who'd been waiting a while and hadn't enjoyed it. And when the wagon rolled in, he swung down and unfolded a paper of his own, and Clara felt the day's joy go cold in her chest, because she knew a paper meant trouble, the way she knew smoke meant fire. "Ethan Caldwell," the rider said. "That's me. I'm from the county seat. I'm serving notice." He held out the paper. "Harold Pierce filed this morning to move the due date on your note. Claims cause says he's got word you're selling off assets and mean to skip the debt, running your cattle and your stores to the mining camps to turn them to cash and disappear. Judge granted an emergency hearing on it. The note's not due Friday anymore, Mr. Caldwell." He held Ethan's eyes. "It's due tomorrow, noon, at the county seat, in front of the judge. Full sum, or Pierce takes the water rights by court order, and there's no spring buyer or mining camp going to unwind a court order once it's signed." The yard went dead silent, and Clara Whitmore understood in one cold rush exactly what had happened, that Harold Pierce had somehow gotten word of the wagon of the mining camps of the very thing they'd done to save themselves, and had turned it into a weapon, had gone to a judge and painted their rescue as a swindle, a debtor selling off his assets to skip his debt, and had moved the whole fight from his store counter, where $400 would have settled it, to a courtroom, where the fight was no longer about money at all. "He heard," she said quietly. "Somebody carried word down the mountain faster than we came down it. He heard about the camps and he turned it around. He's telling a judge we sold your winter to run out on the debt." She looked at Ethan. "We've got the money now. More than the money. But he's moved it somewhere. The money's not enough. He's moved it to a place where it's your word against his in front of a judge who doesn't know either of you. And Pierce is the respectable merchant, and you're the failing rancher who just sold off his whole cellar in the dead of winter and drove it over a mountain in secret." Her jaw tightened. "Which looks to a stranger in a robe like exactly what Pierce is saying it looks like." The rider tipped his hat remounted and rode off into the dusk, leaving the paper in Ethan's hand, and the whole triumph of the mountain turned in the space of a minute into a trap. And Ethan Caldwell stood in his own yard with $512 in a strongbox and a court order in his fist. And for the first time since Clara had known him, he looked truly beaten. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for," Ethan said hollowly. "I thought he was just cruel. He's cruel and he's smart, and that's the worst thing a man can be. He knew I might scrape the money, so he changed the game. Now it doesn't matter if I've got 400 or 4,000, because tomorrow it's not about whether I can pay. It's about whether a judge believes I meant to." He crumpled the paper in his fist. And why would he look at it his way? Failing rancher dead ranch. And then all of a sudden, the man sells off his entire winter store in secret before dawn and hauls it over a frozen Ford to sell for cash. That's not the story of a man saving his ranch. That's the story of a man cashing out to run. Pierce didn't even have to lie. He just had to tell the true story wrong. "Then we tell it right," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "We tell it right, Ethan." She climbed down off the wagon, and the exhaustion was gone from her, burned off by something harder. "In front of the judge. Tomorrow. We don't hide from that courtroom, we walk into it and we tell the whole true story, the real one, and we bring proof." Her mind was already moving fast, the way it moved at the woodpile, the way it moved when the arithmetic said stop. "Pierce's whole case is that you sold the meat to run out on the debt. But a man running out on a debt doesn't come home. He runs. And here you are home a full day early with the money in a box, driving up your own road in front of 9 witnesses, meaning to pay him. Does that look like a man skipping town?" Ethan blinked. "And a man selling assets to cheat a creditor," Clara went on. "Doesn't sell them to 400 witnesses and let a miner named Cole take up a collection to help him pay the very debt Pierce says he's skipping. Ethan, that whole camp saw what we did and why. Cole stood up in front of 400 men and said out loud that the money was to beat a paper holder who was taking a good man's water. We've got 400 witnesses to your intent, and the best of them would ride down that mountain to say so if we asked." She took the crumpled paper out of his hand and smoothed it. "Pierce told the true story wrong, so we bring the men who watched the true story happen, and we let them tell it right, and we let the judge decide which is more likely, that you drove over a frozen Ford in secret to cheat Harold Pierce, or that you did it to pay him in front of witnesses because he'd left you no other way." Del Rooney stepped forward. "I'll ride for Cole tonight," he said. "Back over the Ford up the draw. I can be at the camp by dawn and back with him by mid-morning if the ice holds. He'll come. You know he'll come." He looked at Clara. That man had crossed the Ford himself to strike a blow at a paper holder. We heard him say it. "It's a hard ride in the dark," Amos said. "Falls Ford twice more in a day." "I've crossed it twice already," Del said. "Third time won't kill me. And I'll not sit in a warm bunkhouse while Pierce takes this ranch on a lie. Not again. I did enough sitting warm while Clara held that fire." He was already turning for the barn. "I'll bring Cole. You get Ethan to that courtroom with the money and the story. We'll tell it right between us, all of it." And Clara Whitmore stood in the darkening yard, the strongbox at her feet, and the court order in her hand, and the whole thing balanced once again on a knife's edge, not the edge of a frozen Ford this time, but the edge of a stranger's judgment in a robe. The oldest edge there was for a woman like her, the edge of whether the powerful would be believed over the true. She'd stood on that edge her whole life. She had never once been given the benefit of the doubt on it. But she had never once either walked into that courtroom with 400 witnesses and a good man beside her, and the truth on her side, and a fire in her chest that no storm and no Ford and no paper-holding buzzard in a good coat had managed to put out. "Del rides for Cole," she said. "Amos, you'll drive us to the county seat before light, you know the roads. Ethan." She turned to him, and she took his beaten face in both her hands the way she had at the Ford. "You've spent 2 years believing that town's story about you. The lost wife, the lost grip, the ruined ranch. Tomorrow, Harold Pierce is going to stand up in a courtroom and tell that story one more time, the worst version of it in front of a judge. And you're going to stand up after him and tell the true one." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" Can you stand up in front of that town after 2 years of sitting down and tell them who you really are?" Ethan Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly the beaten look left his face, and what came into its place was the thing she'd seen the day he walked into town and faced down Pierce over her, the thing that had straightened the whole ranch, the thing she'd known was in him under the 2 years of ash, the way she'd known the good bones were under the dead smokehouse. "I stood up once already," he said. "For you, in that store." He put his hands over hers. "Reckon I can stand up once more, for both of us." He looked out at the dark road toward the county seat, toward the courtroom and the judge and Harold Pierce, and the whole hard reckoning waiting there at noon. "Let him tell it wrong, Clara. Let him stand up in his good coat and tell that judge his lie." His jaw set. "And then we'll bring in a coal miner named Cole, and 9 ranch hands, and a woman who crossed the falls ford, throwing herself against a falling horse, and we'll tell it right. And we'll see which story a man believes when he's made to look at both of them side by side in the light." The yard held its breath. Dell's horse was already moving out toward the ford in the dark, carrying their one hope of a witness back up the mountain. And somewhere in town, Harold Pierce sat with his filed paper and his moved date, and his true story told wrong. Certain the way he'd been certain from the very first day that no rancher's word and no fat woman's fire could stand against a respectable man's paper in a court of law. He had been wrong about Clara Whitmore every single time he'd ever reckoned her. He was about to be wrong one more time in front of a judge with the water rights to a whole valley riding on it. And this time there would be no unwinding it for him or for them once the story was told. Amos had them on the road to the county seat 2 hours before light, and nobody spoke for the first hour. Clara sat beside Ethan with the strongbox between her feet and the court order folded in her lap. And she went over the story in her mind, the way she went over the arithmetic, checking it, and checking it again, looking for the place where it broke. Because there was always a place where it broke. That was the thing Pierce understood, that most cruel men didn't. A lie doesn't beat the truth by being stronger. It beats the truth by finding the one seam where the truth looks strange and prying it open in front of a stranger who wasn't there to see how it really was. And the seam was there. She could feel it. "He's going to make the ford the center of it," she said at last. "The secrecy, the before dawn, that's his seam. Ethan, and he's smart enough to find it. A man with nothing to hide doesn't sell his whole winter store in the dark and drive it over a killing ford where no witness would follow. That's the piece that looks strange. That's the piece a judge who wasn't there will snag on." She turned to him. "So we can't let him get to it first. We have to be the ones who bring up the dark and the ford before he does, and explain it so that when he stands up and says it like it's damning, the judge has already heard the true reason, and Pierce just looks like a man twisting a thing he already knows the answer to. And the true reasons that I'd have stopped you," Ethan said quietly. "You went in the dark because you knew I'd stop you out of pride. That's the truth. But Clara, I stand up in a courtroom and say my own hired woman had to sneak my winter out before dawn because she didn't trust me not to ruin the plan that doesn't make me look like an honest man. That makes me look like a fool who couldn't run his own ranch." "Yes," Clara said. "It does." She held his eyes. "And that's exactly why the judge will believe it." Ethan looked at her. "A lie flatters the man telling it," she said. "Every time. That's how you spot one. Pierce's story flatters Pierce, the clever merchant who caught the swindler. But a man doesn't stand up in front of a whole town and make himself look like a fool who couldn't manage his own crew unless it's true, because there's no vanity in it. There's nothing in it for him but the shame of it. When you stand up and say, 'My hired woman went behind my back because she was right, and I'd have been wrong,' every soul in that room is going to know it's true, because no proud man invents a story where he's the one who was about to get it wrong." She squeezed his hand. "The shame is the proof, Ethan. Your willingness to look small is the thing Pierce can't fake and can't answer. So we lead with it. We give them the whole embarrassing true story, and we let your shame stand there as the thing that no swindler would ever say about himself." Amos up front let out a low sound that might have been a laugh. "Woman thinks like a lawyer," he said to the dark road. "Thinks like a lawyer and cures a hog like an angel. Ethan Caldwell, if you don't marry her the day this is done, you're a bigger fool than any story Pierce can tell." "I mean to," Ethan said. "I know you do." Amos flicked the reins. "I'm just making sure you don't forget it in a courtroom. Men forget things in courtrooms." They came into the county seat as the town was waking, and Clara felt the old landing of eyes the moment they rolled down the main street, the merchants opening their shops. The women with their baskets, all of them turning to watch the failing rancher and the fat woman ride in to answer Harold Pierce's paper. And all of them, she could see already knowing the story Pierce had told, already having decided it. She sat straight under it. She'd sat straight under worse, but Ethan had gone tight beside her, and she put her hand over his on the seat. "They've decided," he said low. "Look at them. He's been in town a day ahead of us telling it. They've already decided." "They've decided what Pierce told them," Clara said. "They haven't heard us yet. A town that's decided is just a town that's only heard one side. We change that in the next 2 hours, or we don't. Either way, we don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us ride in ashamed of a thing we're not ashamed of." She lifted her chin. "Sit up, Ethan. You crossed the falls ford. Not one soul on this street has done a brave thing this winter, and you've done 3. Sit up and let them look." He sat up, and they rode the rest of the main street with their backs straight, the failing rancher and the fat woman. And if the town had expected them to come in beaten, the town was disappointed. The courtroom was a plain room over the county offices, and it was full. That was the first blow, and Clara felt Ethan take it the whole town had turned out because a rancher losing his water to a merchant was the best entertainment the county had seen all winter, and they'd come to watch it happen. Harold Pierce was already seated at the front in his good coat, and beside him was a lawyer, a sleek man from the county seat with a leather case. And Clara understood with a cold drop in her stomach that Pierce had brought a professional, and they had brought themselves. "He's got a lawyer," Ethan breathed. "I see him." "Clara, we don't have a lawyer. We've got a strong box and a story and a miner who might not make it down the ford in time. That man does this for a living." "That man does this for a living," Clara agreed, "which means that man has spent his life learning how to make a true thing sound false, and a false thing sound true. And he's good at it, and he's expensive, and Pierce paid for him." She turned to Ethan. "But there's one thing that lawyer can't do, Ethan, that we can. He wasn't there. Not at the smokehouse, not at the ford, not at the camp. Everything he knows secondhand from Pierce, and Pierce knows it third-hand, from whoever carried the word down the mountain. We're the only people in this room who were actually there. So he'll be smooth, and he'll be clever, and he'll tie the law in knots, and every knot he ties we untie by saying the one thing he can never say." She held Ethan's eyes. "We were there. He wasn't. Let him be clever. We'll be true. And true was there, and clever wasn't." The judge came in. He was an older man, gray and unhurried, with the tired, careful face of a man who had spent 30 years listening to people lie to him and had gotten good at not showing what he thought of it. And Clara studied him the way she studied a sky, looking for the weight in the bottom of it, looking for what he was under the flat gray front. And what she read in the way he settled and squared his papers and looked out over the packed room without any appetite for the show of it was a man who was tired of clever. A man who'd heard clever his whole career and had learned the hard, slow way to trust it less the smoother it got. That was something. That was a seam of her own to work. "Harold Pierce," the judge said, "you've filed to move a note and called an emergency hearing on cause. This is not a thing I grant lightly, and not a thing I like granting at all. So you'll tell me your cause plain, and your lawyer will tell it plainer, and then I'll hear the other side, and then I'll decide, and I'll not be hurried by either of you. Mr. Ashford, you may begin." The lawyer Ashford rose, and he was smooth, exactly as smooth as Clara had feared. He laid it out clean and damning the failing ranch, the mounting debt, the seasonal interest come due during the storm and not paid, and then, in a voice of grave concern, the discovery. That the debtor Caldwell, rather than come to his creditor in good faith, had instead loaded his entire winter store onto a wagon in the dead of night before dawn in secret and driven it over the falls. For a crossing. Ashford noted that no honest man of business would take a crossing chosen precisely because no witness would follow to sell it for cash at the mining camps. This, Ashford said, was not the conduct of a man meaning to pay his debt. This was the conduct of a man converting his assets to portable cash in preparation to abandon his obligations and his land and the law, provided in such cases for a creditor to protect himself by calling the note before the debtor could vanish. He sold everything, Your Honor, Ashford finished. In the dark, in secret, over a river that would have hidden the evidence had he drowned in it. I ask the court, what does a man do that for if not to run? It was good. Clara felt the room move with it. It was clever, and it found the seam, and it pried exactly as she'd known it would, and she watched the judge's tired face and could not read whether it had landed. The judge turned to them. Mr. Caldwell, you've no lawyer. No, Your Honor. You mean to speak for yourself. Ethan stood. His hat was in his hands. And Clara watched him take a breath, and she willed the whole of her own certainty across the room into his spine. And Ethan Caldwell began in front of the whole town that had counted him out for 2 years to tell the true story. I do, Your Honor. And I'll tell you the truth, which is that most of what Mr. Ashford just said is fact. I did sell my winter store. I did load it in the dark before dawn. I did drive it over the Falls Ford. Every piece of that is true. A murmur went through the room, and Clara saw Pierce's mouth curve, thinking Ethan had just hanged himself. But there's one piece Mr. Ashford's got wrong, and it's the piece that matters, and it's the why. And I'll tell you the why, Your Honor, even though it shames me because it's true. And because a man ought to be able to bear looking small in front of his neighbors, if the alternative is looking honest by lying. The judge's tired eyes sharpened just slightly. Go on. I didn't load that wagon in the dark, Ethan said. I woke to find it already loaded. By her. He turned and looked at Clara. That's Clara Whitmore, Your Honor. I hired her this fall to salt my pork and fix a smokehouse I'd let die for 2 years on account of I'd lost my wife and lost my grip and let the whole place fall to ruin, which is a story this town knows well and tells often. She fixed the smokehouse. She cured more meat than I'd seen on my ranch in 3 years. She held it through the storm that near killed us all, held a fire alone for 3 days, while my men and I were snowed into our houses because she wouldn't let the winter beat her. And when Pierce called the seasonal interest during that storm and moved to take my water, it was her, not me, who figured a way to save it. He looked back at the judge. She figured we could sell the overage to the mining camps for the $400 I owed, and she was right. But she knew I'd say no, because I'm a proud man. Your Honor, and a proud man doesn't like being saved, least of all by the woman he hired to salt his pork. So she loaded that wagon before dawn without telling me, so I couldn't stop her out of pride. And when I woke and found her doing it and stood in the barn door to forbid it, I didn't. I climbed up on the wagon instead, because she was right, and I was wrong, and a man's got to be able to know the difference even when it costs him his pride. He turned the hat in his hands. So there's your dark, and there's your secret, and there's your before dawn, Your Honor. It wasn't a swindler hiding his tracks. It was a proud fool being saved by a better soul than him over his own objection in the only way she could manage it quiet before he could get in the way. I'm not proud of the story, but it's the true one, and I'll not tell you a prouder lie in its place. The room had gone very quiet, and Clara watched the judge's tired face and saw the thing she'd hoped to see, that the shame in Ethan's story had done exactly what she'd promised him it would, that no man in a robe who'd spent 30 years hearing clever lies could hear a man volunteer to look like a fool and not feel the weight of its truth. But Ashford was on his feet. A touching story, Your Honor, and a convenient one. But it's just that a story told by the debtor with no witness but the woman he's now claiming saved him, who has every reason to support whatever tale keeps her employer solvent and herself employed. He turned smooth as oil. Can Mr. Caldwell produce a single witness to this noble rescue who is not himself or not in his pay? A single soul, Not a Caldwell ranch hand who eats at his table. Who can swear this wagon went up the mountain to pay a debt and not to flee one? And there it was. The real trap. The one Clara had seen coming from the moment the rider appeared in the yard, that every witness they had was a Caldwell man, and a Caldwell man's word could be waved away as bought. It all came down to coal. It came down to whether Dell had made it over the ford in the dark and up the draw and back, whether a coal miner they'd met 2 days ago had thought their fight worth a hard cold ride, whether he was right now anywhere on the road. And Cole was not in the room. Clara felt the whole thing tilting, and she made the only choice left to make. She stood up. "Your Honor, I'm the woman he's talking about, Clara Whitmore. And Mr. Ashford's right that I'm in Mr. Caldwell's pay, so my word's worth what a paid word's worth, and I'll not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I'd ask the court one thing before it decides, and it's a small thing." She held the judge's tired eyes. Mr. Ashford asked, "Can we produce one witness not in Caldwell's pay? Give us till the noon hour." That's when the notes due noon by Pierce's own filing. "We've sent for a witness. A man who's never met Ethan Caldwell before this week, who owes him nothing, and eats at no man's table but his own, and who watched the whole thing happen at the camp and can tell you why that wagon came up the mountain. He's riding hard over the Falls Ford to get here. Give us till noon, the hour Pierce himself chose, and if the witness hasn't come, then you decide on what you've got, and I'll not say a word against it." She paused. Pierce set the hour at noon. Surely he'll not object to being held to his own hour. It was neatly done, and she saw Ashford see it, that to object to waiting until noon was to object to the very deadline Pierce had filed for, and the judge saw it too, and something that was almost the ghost of dry amusement crossed his tired face. "The note's due at noon," the judge said. "It's Mr. Pierce's own hour. I'll not decide a man's water rights before the hour his creditor chose to demand them." He looked at the clock on the wall. "It wants 40 minutes of noon. We'll wait them out. Mr. Pierce, you filed for noon. You'll get noon. If Mr. Caldwell's witness isn't through that door by the time that hand's straight up, I'll hear no more of him, and I'll decide on what's before me." He settled back. 40 minutes. We'll wait. 40 minutes. Clara sat down, and Ethan sat beside her, and neither of them looked at the door, because to look at the door was to show the whole room how much hung on it, and Clara had trained the showing out of herself decades ago. But she counted. She counted the minutes on the clock, and she counted the miles of the ford and the draw in her head, and she did the one arithmetic she could not make come out right, which was whether a man could ride from that camp to this room in the time there'd been, over ice in winter, and she got the same answer every time she ran it, which was barely. If nothing went wrong. If the ice held. If coal came at all. The minutes went by. Pierce at the front had recovered his certainty. Clara watched him lean to Ashford and murmur, watched the small satisfied set of his shoulders, watched him take out his pocket watch and check it against the wall clock with the air of a man watching a pot come slowly to the boil. He was sure. He'd been sure from the first day. And as the clock hand climbed toward noon and the door stayed shut, Clara felt the whole room growing sure, along with him. Felt the town settling into the ending it had ridden in, expecting the failing rancher losing his water. To the clever merchant, the natural order of things restored. 10 minutes of noon. The door stayed shut. "Clara," Ethan breathed. "If he doesn't come, he'll come. The ice was going soft when we crossed. If it broke up, if Dell couldn't get over, he'll come, Ethan." But she didn't know it. She said it the way she'd said everything her whole life that she needed to be true and couldn't make true by wanting flat and certain, and with the fear pressed down under it where no one could see. Coal crossed worse than that ford every day to dig another man's coal. A soft ford won't stop him. Nothing that's ever stopped a soft man will stop a hard one. But her hands in her lap were not entirely steady, and she folded them tighter so no one would see. 5 minutes of noon. Ashford rose. "Your Honor, the hour is nearly on us, and I think we've indulged this fiction long enough. There's no witness. There was never going to be a witness. I'd ask the court to—" The door opened. It opened. Hard, banged back on its hinge, and the whole room turned as one. And in the doorway stood Del Rooney, gray-faced and swaying with exhaustion. his coat soaked through and frozen stiff, and behind him, filling the frame a head taller and twice as broad. Coal dust ground into the lines of his hands, and a 2-day beard on his weathered face stood Cole. Clara's breath went out of her all at once. "Beg the court's pardon," Cole said, in a voice that carried to every corner without trying. "Ice broke up on the ford behind us not 20 minutes back. This young fella and me came across on the last of it that held. Reckon we're the last 2 men'll cross that ford till it freezes again." He looked around the room, took in the judge, took in Pierce in his good coat, and something hardened in his face at the sight of the good coat. "I'm told there's a man in here fixing to take Ethan Caldwell's water on a story about why a wagon came up my mountain. I was there when that wagon came. I reckon I'm the witness you're waiting on." "Come forward," the judge said, "and tell me who you are and how you come to be here, and mind you tell it plain, because I've had my fill of clever this morning." Cole came forward. Dell half fell into a chair by the door, and a woman from the town unbidden brought him water, because even a town that had come to watch a hanging has a heart for a boy who's near killed himself riding. "Name's Cole," the big miner said. "I dig coal at the high camp up the pass. 2 days back a wagon came up the back draw over the Falls Ford, which I didn't credit was possible in winter till I saw it done. Woman driving it stood up on the bench and sold us smoked pork. First decent food that camp's seen since October. Good pork cured right." He glanced at Clara, and something in his hard face gentled. "I bought the first cut, and I bought the last, and in between I watched her sell it, and I heard her say plain to the whole camp that she needed $400, because some paper holder down the valley was fixing to take a good man's water rights that Friday over a debt." "Besides in a bum, he says so." The room was dead silent. "Now I've lost ground to a paper holder myself," Cole went on. "Most every man in that camp has. It's why we're digging coal instead of working our own dirt. So when I heard what that money was for, I stood up in front of 400 men, and I said any man with $1 to spare and a memory of losing his own ground ought to put it in the box. And they did. We didn't sell that woman her $400, Your Honor. We gave it to her. Past 400. 500 and better, out of our own pockets, to help a stranger pay a debt to a man in a good coat." He turned and looked directly at Harold Pierce. "So when I hear that same money's being called a swindle, that this man loaded that wagon to run out on his debt, I'll tell you what I know for a fact, because I was there, and this lawyer wasn't. That wagon came up my mountain for one reason and one reason only. To raise the money to pay. Not to run from the debt. To pay it. And 400 coal miners will swear to it, and I'll ride down and bring every last one of them, if this court needs them Ford or no Ford." Ashford was on his feet. "Your Honor, this man is—" "This man, but," the judge said, "was there. Which is more than I can say for you, Mr. Ashford, or for your client, or for the story you spent the morning selling me." He'd sat forward now, and the tired gray front was gone off him, and under it was something with an edge. "Sit down." Ashford sat down. The judge looked at Cole a long moment, and then at Dell shivering in the chair by the door, and then at the strong box at Ethan's feet, and then for a long while at Harold Pierce. "Mr. Pierce," he said, "you filed that this man loaded his stores to flee his debt, and now I've got a coal miner who rode over a breaking river to swear the man loaded his stores to pay it in front of 400 witnesses who took up a collection to help him do it. Those are not two versions of a story, Mr. Pierce. Those are a lie, and the truth, and I've been on this bench 30 years, and I know which one just walked through that door soaked to the bone." He leaned back. "You want to tell me I'm wrong? You want to put your hand up and swear this miner rode over a breaking ford to lie for a man he met 2 days ago?" Harold Pierce's mouth opened, and nothing came out, because there was nothing to say. Clara watched it happen, watched the certainty drain out of the man who'd been certain since the first day. Watched him look at Cole and at Dell and at the judge's hard, tired eyes, and understand at last that his clever story had met the one thing clever can never beat, which is a true thing told by a man who was there and has nothing to gain by telling it. "The seasonal interest," the judge said. $30. Was it tendered before this hearing? Your Honor. Ethan said, I've got $400 in that box this minute. The full note tendered a full day before Pierce's own Friday, and I'd have had the 30 to him during the storm if I hadn't been snowed in keeping my men alive. I never once meant not to pay. I've got the paying money sitting at my feet. Then pay it, the judge said. Here, now, count it out on that table, the full note, and Mr. Pierce will mark it satisfied, and I'll witness it, and that will be the end of this. He fixed Pierce with a look. And as for your emergency, Mr. Pierce, I find no cause. I find a creditor who moved a good man's note to a courtroom on a story he had to know was false, in the hope the man couldn't reach his witnesses in time. That's not protecting a debt. That's using my court to steal water, and I don't care for my court being used that way. He picked up his pen. The note's to be paid in full today, as tendered. The original terms stand for anything past it. And Mr. Pierce, you'll pay this court's costs for the emergency you invented, and you'll think hard next time before you bring me a clever story about a man who turns out to have driven over a mountain to pay you. It was done. Clara heard the room exhale, heard the murmur run through the town that had ridden in certain of the other ending, and she watched Ethan Caldwell kneel by the strongbox with hands that shook and count $400 onto the county table, coin by coin in front of the whole town that had counted him out. And she watched Harold Pierce, gray and silent, mark the note satisfied because a judge had told him to, and she felt something in her chest that she had waited her whole life to feel, and had near stopped believing she ever would. Not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of having been right out loud in front of everyone and having it stand. They came out of the courthouse into the noon light, and the town was different than it had been 2 hours before. Word had run through it the way word does, and the same faces that had watched them ride in, certain of their ruin, now watched them come out having won. And there is nothing a town loves like a story that turned. And Clara felt the eyes on her change their weight still the same, landing the pass over her body, but under it now, something new, something she'd almost never felt in a town respect, grudging and startled but real. Cole came out behind them, and Ethan turned and gripped the big miner's hand in both of his. I don't know how to thank a man for what you did. Don't. Cole waved it off. You gave 400 hungry men decent food when they'd forgot what it tasted like. And then you let us be part of beating a paper holder, which not one of us ever got to do on our own ground. That's the thanks. That's more than the thanks. He looked at Clara. It was her, though. You know that. She stood up on that wagon and made 400 hard men remember they had hearts. I've watched a lot of people try to move that camp. Never saw anybody do it like her. He touched his hat to her the real way, the way that meant it. Ma'am, if you ever tire of curing this man's pork, there's 400 miners up the pass would follow you into anything. I'll not tire of it, Clara said. But I'll not forget the offer, Mr. Cole, nor the ride you made to keep it. Dell had recovered enough to stand wrapped in a blanket someone had found him, and Ethan turned to him last, and for a moment the two men just looked at each other. The rancher and the ranch hand who'd mocked Clara that first day, and then near killed himself riding a breaking ford to save her plan. You crossed that ford 3 times in 2 days, Ethan said. The last time on ice that broke behind you. 4 times if you count both ways. Dell managed a shaky grin. Reckon I owed her a hard ride. I sat warm in your house while she held that fire alone through the storm, boss. I wasn't going to sit warm twice. He looked at Clara, and the grin softened into something that wasn't a grin at all. I said some things that first day, ma'am, about smoked dreams, about you being winded by the second day. I've been trying to make up for it ever since, and I don't reckon I have yet. You crossed a breaking river for me, Mr. Rooney, Clara said gently. I'd call the account settled, more than settled. She put her hand on his blanketed shoulder. Your granddaddy'd be proud of you, whatever wood he cured his hogs with. Dell laughed, and it cracked halfway through, and he looked away and blinked hard at the street, and Clara let him keep his dignity and turned back to Ethan. And Ethan Caldwell was looking at her the way he'd looked at her across the fire the night she'd told him he had good bones, The startled, wounded look of a man shown a thing he'd stopped believing in, except now there was no fear left under it, and no ash, and no 2 years of grief holding him back from the thing. "It's done," he said. "The water's mine. The ranch is mine. Pierce is beaten in his own filed hour in front of the whole town." He shook his head slowly. "3 weeks ago, I was a dead man walking around a dead ranch, and you walked up my road with a bag of salt." "I walked up your road looking for honest work," Clara said. "That's all I ever came for, Ethan. I'll tell you that plain same as I've told you everything plain. I didn't come up your road looking for anything more than a smokehouse to run, and a wage to earn, and a place where a woman could be judged by her work instead of her size for one season before the world remembered to laugh." She met his eyes. "I didn't come looking for the rest of it. I'd stopped looking for the rest of it a long time ago. It costs too much to keep looking and never find." "And now?" Clara was quiet a moment. The town moved around them. The noon light lay over the street, and there was nowhere to hide in any of it, which was, she'd always said, the only kind of light she trusted. "You asked me at the ford," she said. "You kissed me in the daylight, and I told you we'd settle the rest after we'd settled with Pierce, because I'll not marry a landless man." She looked at him steady. "Well, we've settled with Pierce, and you're not landless anymore, Ethan Caldwell. You've got your water and your ground, and a cellar we'll fill back up by spring, and a crew that'd cross a river for you, and a woman standing in front of you in the plain noon light of the county seat who's done being afraid of wanting the thing she wants." She lifted her chin. "So ask me again. Right here, in front of the whole town that came to watch you lose. Ask me the thing you've been circling since 2 in the morning that first night, and this time I'll not tell you to stop." And Ethan Caldwell, in the noon light in front of the whole county, took off his hat. He held it in both hands the way he'd held it in the smokehouse doorway, the way a man holds a thing when he's put down everything else he was carrying. And he looked at the woman. The whole town had counted out the woman who had lit his dead fire and turned his crew and crossed a killing ford and stood up on a wagon and beaten a clever man in a courtroom with nothing but the truth and the people who'd witnessed it. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "I've got a ranch again because of you, but that's the smallest thing you gave me back, and I'd be a liar to stand here and pretend otherwise. You gave me back the man I was before I let the fire go out. You looked at a ruin everybody had written off, and you saw good bones, and you did it twice, once with my smokehouse, and once with me." He turned the hat in his hands. "I don't want you managing my food production. I don't want you as the woman I hired. I want you as my wife and my partner in every foot of that ground, equal in the deed and equal in the name. And I want to spend the rest of my winters knowing you're across the fire from me instead of a wall away. Marry me, Clara. Not the 2 in the morning woman, the noon woman. The one standing here in the light where the whole world can see her. Marry me." Boom! And Clara Whitmore, who had trained the weeping out of herself decades ago, wept for the second time in a week, standing in the noon light of the county seat with the whole town watching, and she did not care who saw it, because for the first time in her life, the tears were not the kind she'd spent a lifetime hiding. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ethan Caldwell. I'll marry you." And the town that had come to watch a man lose his water watched instead a rancher put his hat back on and take a fat woman's face in both his hands and kiss her in the plain light of noon. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman started clapping, and then another, and then the whole street, because there is one thing a town loves even more than a story that turns, and that is a man who was dead coming back to life. And everyone on that street could see plain as the noon light that that was exactly what they were watching. Cole let out a whoop that startled the horses. Dell, wrapped in his blanket, grinned through the tears he was still pretending he wasn't crying. And Harold Pierce came down the courthouse steps behind them, gray and beaten and smaller than he'd ever looked. And he stopped a moment at the sight of it, the whole town clapping for the 2 people he'd spent a month trying to grind into the dirt. And then he pushed through the edge of the crowd and was gone. And not one soul turned to watch him go, and that Clara thought was the truest measure of how it had all turned out. A month ago, the whole valley had watched Harold Pierce and laughed at Clara Whitmore, and now, The whole valley was clapping for Clara Whitmore, and no one could be troubled to watch Harold Pierce leave. The value was never in what they saw first. It was in what had been there all along, waiting for somebody to bother to look. And standing in the noon light with Ethan's hands warm on her face and the whole town clapping around her, Clara Whitmore understood that she had finally, after a lifetime of being counted out, walked into a room and been counted in, and that she had done it the only way she'd ever known how. The way her father had taught her, the way she'd cured the meat and held the fire and crossed the ford and beaten the lie. By being twice as good as anyone expected, and refusing ever to believe them when they said she was less. They were married 3 weeks later in the little church at the edge of the county seat, and the whole valley came. That was the thing Clara could not get over in the days leading up to it. The whole valley came. The same town that had watched her ride in a month before, certain of her ruin, now sent word by every road that they'd be there, and the women who'd looked past her in the store now came out to the ranch with their hands full. A bolt of good cloth from one, a set of her grandmother's plates from another. A woman Clara had never met, driving 3 miles in the cold to bring a wedding quilt she'd been keeping folded in a chest for a daughter who'd never married. "I don't understand it," Clara said to Ethan the night before in the little room off the kitchen she'd soon be leaving for the big bedroom at the front of the house. "A month ago, not one of them would meet my eye in the street. Now they can't do enough. It doesn't sit right with me. I keep waiting for the other thing. The laugh, the look. It's always come before." Ethan was quiet a moment, leaned in the doorway with his hat in his hand, the way he still did, the way she'd come to love. "You want the truth," he said. "The hard truth, the way you always give it to me. Always. They're not being kind because they suddenly see you clear." Ethan turned the hat in his hands. "Most of them still don't. Most of them will go to their graves not seeing past your size because that's a thing broke in them, not in you, and a broken thing in a person doesn't mend just because they watched you win once." He met her eyes. "But they came out to the ranch and brought their quilts because you did a thing in front of them that they can't stop thinking about. You stood up on a wagon and beat Harold Pierce, who's held paper over half of them for years, who's mocked and squeezed and lorded over this whole valley, and you beat him with nothing but work and truth and a fat woman's nerve. And every one of them that ever felt small under Pierce's thumb saw you do the thing they never could." He shook his head slowly. "They're not honoring you because they finally see you, Clara. They're honoring you because you did a thing they wish they'd had the courage to do. It's half selfish. Most kindness is. But it's real for all that, and it's yours, and you earned every quilt of it." Clara looked at him a long moment. "That's the least comforting thing anybody's ever said to me," she said. "You said you wanted the truth. I did." And then slowly a smile broke across her round, tired face. "And you're right, which is worse. You're always right lately. It's a hard thing to marry a man who listens well enough to tell you the truth back in your own voice." She reached out and took his hand. "But I'd rather have the true comfort than the sweet lie. You know that about me by now. My daddy raised me on true comfort. Sweet lies were for people who could afford them, and I never could." She squeezed his hand. "Half selfish and real. I'll take it. It's more than I've had from any town in my life, and I'll not turn my nose up at real just because it isn't pure. Pure's another sweet lie. Real's the thing you can build on." They were married in the morning. Clara wore the good cloth the storekeeper's wife had brought, made up into a dress by 3 of the ranch women working together in the last week. And it fit her. Actually fit her, cut for her body, instead of forcing her body into a cut meant for somebody else. And she stood in front of the little mirror in the room off the kitchen, and looked at herself in a dress made to fit her as she was. And she near didn't make it out the door for the crying. "None of that," said the storekeeper's wife, dabbing at Clara's face with a handkerchief. "You'll ruin your eyes, and I didn't sew this dress for a red-eyed bride. There now. You look—" The woman stopped, and something moved across her face, something that might have been the first real seeing Clara had gotten from her. "You look like a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. That's the finest thing a bride can look like, and most of them never manage it. Half the girls I've dressed for that church walked up the aisle hoping the man would make them worth something. You're walking up it already knowing. It's a different thing entirely. She stepped back. Go on then, he's waiting. And that man's waited 2 years for something to wait for. Don't make it 2 years and an hour. Clara walked up the aisle on Amos Freed's arm, because she had no father to give her away, and Amos had said gruff and red-faced that an old trapper who'd led her over the Falls Ford twice reckoned he had as much right as any man to walk her the length of a church, and she'd wept at that too, and told him yes. Del Rooney stood up with Ethan scrubbed and stiff in a collar that was strangling him, grinning like the whole thing was his own doing. And Cole came down off the mountain. He came in the back of the church halfway through, filling the doorway, the way he filled every doorway. Coal dust scrubbed off for once, and a clean shirt straining across his shoulders. And behind him came a dozen of the miners from the high camp. Hard men in their Sunday best. Come down a mountain and over a frozen ford to watch a woman they'd known for a month marry the man they'd helped her save. Clara saw them come in over Ethan's shoulder as she reached the altar, and she near stopped the whole ceremony to go to them. And Cole caught her eye and shook his head and touched his hat and mouthed, "Go on, ma'am," and she went on. They were married under the eyes of the whole valley, and a dozen coal miners, and an old trapper, and a reformed loudmouth, and when the preacher said the words, and Ethan Caldwell kissed her, the church erupted, and it was Cole's whoop that led it same as it had led the cheering at the courthouse. The big miner's voice booming up over the pews and the whole valley on its feet. The wedding supper was held at the ranch in the yard with the smokehouse warm and working in the background, and the tables groaning under food, and it was the strangest gathering the county had ever hosted. Town merchants and coal miners and ranch hands and church women all elbow to elbow, and somewhere past the middle of it, Clara found herself standing a little apart, watching it the way she'd spent her whole life watching rooms from the edge of them. Except she wasn't at the edge of this one. She was the center of it. And she'd walked to the edge on her own out of old habit, and she stood there a moment and understood the habit for what it was, a lifetime of standing where she wouldn't be in anyone's way, where she couldn't be laughed at, where she could watch the warmth without ever expecting to be asked into it. And then Ethan crossed the whole yard to find her. "You've drifted to the edge again," he said, coming up beside her. "I've noticed you do that. At a gathering you find the edge of it quiet where you can watch. You did it at the courthouse steps, and you're doing it now at your own wedding." "Old habit," Clara said. "The edge is safe. You can see the whole room from the edge, and nobody can see you, and nobody can decide about you if they've forgot you're there. I've stood at the edge of every room I've ever been in." She looked out at the warm, crowded yard. "It's hard to unlearn. 30 years of a thing doesn't unlearn in a month, even a month like this one." Ethan held out his hand. "Then don't unlearn it tonight," he said. "Just come stand in the middle of this one with me. You don't have to trust it yet. You don't have to believe it'll last. Just stand in the middle of it the once tonight, and let them see you, and let yourself be seen, and we'll worry about the unlearning tomorrow." His hand stayed out. "You spent your whole life telling other people they were worth more than what folks saw first. You told it to me about my ranch. You told it to my smokehouse, out loud like a fool, and you were right. I heard you say it." He looked at her. "It's your turn to believe it about yourself. Come stand in the middle, Clara. You earned the middle. You crossed a river for the middle." Clara Whitmore looked at his outstretched hand, and she took it, and she let him walk her from the edge into the middle of the warm, crowded yard, into the light and the noise and the whole valley's eyes, and she stood there in the middle at her own wedding, and for the first time in her 30 years, she did not drift back to the edge. The winter came in hard after that, the way the sky had promised since the first day she'd walked up the road. But the Caldwell Ranch was ready for it, now the cellar filling back toward full. As the weeks went on, the smokehouse warm and working, and Clara ran it the way she'd always run a smokehouse before light, and after dark, except now it was her own. Her name on the deed beside Ethan's, her ground under the building, and there was a difference in the work she hadn't expected. She'd spent her whole life curing other men's meat in other men's smokehouses, doing the humble work that never once bought her a place of her own. Watching, as she'd told Ethan that first night, ranchers walk past her father in town like they'd never met him. And now the smokehouse was hers, and the meat was hers, And the men who came to the door in the mornings to ask what she needed came to ask their partner, not the hired woman. And Clara found that the same work she'd done her whole life felt entirely different when it was done on ground that couldn't be taken from her. It's the same work, she told Ethan one night by the smokehouse fire deep in the winter. The exact same. Same salt, same wood, same hours. But it doesn't feel the same. I keep waiting to figure out why, and I can't put it plain. You can put anything plain, Ethan said. You just don't want to say this one because it'll cost you a tear and you're rationing them. Clara laughed low. You know me too well. Say it anyway. She was quiet a while, feeding the fire. When I cured other men's meat, she said slowly, I was always curing my way toward the next place. Every batch was a batch that'd end, and then the season would end. And then I'd move on down the road to the next ranch that'd have me for a season. Before they remembered to laugh, and I never once cured a batch I'd be there to see eaten. She watched the smoke pull clean up the chimney. This is the first meat I've ever cured that I'll be here to eat. The first batch I'm not curing my way out of a place with. I'm curing it into one. Her voice caught just slightly. I've been a woman passing through my whole life, Ethan. Passing through towns, passing through ranches, passing through the edges of other people's rooms. And this is the first place I've ever cured meat knowing I'd be here in the spring to see the cellar empty, and here next fall to fill it again, and here the fall after that. It's not the work that's different. It's that the work's got a future in it now, and I never had a future to cure toward before. I only ever had the next season and the next road. She wiped her eye with the back of her wrist, spending the tear she'd been rationing. There, you got your tear. I hope you're satisfied. I'm not satisfied, Ethan said quietly. I don't reckon I'll ever be satisfied knowing how long you went without a future to cure toward. It makes me want to go back in time and find every rancher who let you go at the end of a season, and every town that laughed you down the road, and what? Clara looked at him, and there was no bitterness in her face, only a kind of hard-won peace. Make them see me. You can't make a person see Ethan. You told me that yourself the night before the wedding, the broken things in them, not in me, and it doesn't mend because they watched me win. All those ranchers and all those towns, they're not lying awake regretting me. They forgot me entirely. That's the thing about being passed over. You don't even leave a mark on the ones who pass you. You're not a wound to them. You're not anything to them. You're just a woman they didn't hire or hired for a season and let go and never thought of again. She fed the fire. I made my peace with that a long time ago. What I never made my peace with, what I'd given up on entirely, was that there'd ever be one place, one where I'd be the thing they couldn't forget instead of the thing they never noticed. She looked around the warm smokehouse at the beams full of curing meat at the fire she tended on her own ground. And now I've got it. So I don't need to go back and make anybody see. I don't need the ones who passed me. I've got the one place that didn't. That's enough. That's more than I ever let myself ask for. The winter went on, and it was hard. The hardest the valley had seen in years, but the ranch held. The cellar carried them, and the smokehouse kept working, and when a family down the valley lost their own stores to a burst roof in the January thaw, it was Clara who loaded a wagon with a share of the Caldwell winter and drove it down to them because she knew better than anyone in that valley exactly what it was to face a winter with nothing, and she'd sooner cut her own store thin again than let a family learn that particular fear if she could help it. You gave away a month of our winter, Ethan said when she came back with the empty wagon. He didn't say it angry. He said it the way a man says a thing he already knows the answer to, but wants to hear his wife say anyway. I gave away a month of our winter to a family that had none, Clara said, climbing down. And we've got a hard 6 weeks ahead now instead of an easy 10. I know the arithmetic, Ethan. I did it before I loaded the wagon. She met his eyes. But I've been the family with none. And nobody ever loaded a wagon for me. Not once in 30 years did anybody with a full cellar drive down my road and share it out, because they knew what my winter looked like. Her jaw set. I swore, when Cole stood up on that mountain and took a collection for a stranger, that if I ever had a full cellar of my own, I'd be the one who drove down the road. And now I've got the cellar. So I drove down the road. and I'd do it again tomorrow, and you knew I would when you married me, so don't stand there doing the arithmetic at me like it's a surprise." Ethan Caldwell looked at his wife standing in the yard beside an empty wagon she'd emptied into another family's winter, and he did the thing he'd learned to do in the months since she'd walked up his road, which was to stop trying to keep up with her and simply love her instead. "I'm not doing the arithmetic," he said. "I did the arithmetic the day I married you. It came out saying I'd spend the rest of my life married to the most generous soul in this valley, and I'd best get used to a thinner cellar and a fuller heart, because that's the trade, and it's the best trade I ever made." He took the horse's bridle. "Go on inside. You're froze through. I'll see to the wagon. And Clara—" She stopped. "That family down the valley. They'll tell that story the rest of their lives. The winter the Caldwells drove down the road. Their children'll tell it. You wanted a place where you'd be the thing they couldn't forget instead of the thing they never noticed." He looked at her. "You just made yourself unforgettable to a whole family that'll pass the story down for 3 generations. That's a bigger thing than a full cellar. That's a thing that outlasts you." Clara went inside, and she sat by the fire a while, and she thought about being unforgettable, about a story passed down 3 generations, about the difference between a woman who passes through and a woman who leaves a mark. And she understood slowly that she'd spent her whole life measuring her worth by whether the people in front of her could be bothered to see it, and that she'd had the measuring backward the entire time. Her worth had never been in whether they saw it. It had been in what she did whether they saw it or not. The ranchers who'd let her go at season's end hadn't made her worthless by not seeing her. She'd been worth exactly the same the whole time. The only thing that had changed was that she'd finally landed in a place that happened to look. And the looking was nice. The looking was more than nice. But the worth had been there all along. It hadn't been waiting on the looking. That was the lie she'd half believed her whole life, that her value sat dormant until someone valued it. And it wasn't true, had never been true, was the exact backward of true. Her father had told her curing hogs in other men's smokehouses that a trade was a thing. Nobody could take off you or laugh out of you or price down at the store. And she'd believed him about the trade, but never quite managed to believe it about herself. And now finally, deep in the hardest winter the valley had seen, she believed it about herself. Spring came late, but it came. The snow went off the low ground first, and then the high, and the pass opened, and one of the first wagons over it came down from the high camp, carrying coal and a load of ore for the county smelter, and he swung by the Caldwell ranch on his way through, because he said a man ought to see how a story turned out if he'd had a hand in turning it. "Cellar make it through?" he asked, sitting his horse in the yard. "Barely," Clara said, coming out to meet him. "We'd have had 10 easy weeks, and I cut it to 6, giving a share to a family down the valley. Came down to beans and the last of the smoked pork the final fortnight. But we made it. Everybody made it. Nobody on this ranch went hungry, and neither did that family." She looked up at him. "You started that, Mr. Cole. You know that the driving down the road thing? I'd never once seen it done till I saw you do it on that mountain. 400 men giving their pay to a stranger. I'd have gone my whole life not knowing people did that if you hadn't stood up." She paused. "I gave a family their winter this year because you gave me mine. It runs on down the road, a thing like that. You started something that's still running." Cole was quiet a moment, and something worked in his weathered face. "My daddy lost our farm to a paper holder when I was 12, he said finally. "Man in a good coat, just like your Pierce. Took the ground out from under us over a debt my daddy'd have paid if the man had given him one more season. We never got it back. My daddy died digging another man's coal, same as I'll likely die digging it." He looked out over the Caldwell ground, the green coming up on it, the smokehouse working. "I never got to strike a blow at the man who took our farm. He died rich and old in a good bed, and nobody ever made him answer for it. So when you came up my mountain, and I heard there was a paper holder about to do to Ethan Caldwell what got done to my daddy." His voice roughened. "I didn't stand up on that wagon for you, ma'am. Not entirely. I stood up for a 12-year-old boy who watched his daddy lose everything and never got to do a thing about it. You gave me the blow I never got to strike. So don't thank me for starting something. You're the one gave a broke-down old miner a chance to settle a 30-year account. We're even. More than even. And Clara understood, standing in the spring yard, looking up at the big miner, that she'd never once in the whole hard month of it been the only one being saved. That Ethan had been saving something in himself the day he stood up to Pierce in the store. That Dell had been saving something crossing the ford the fourth time. That Cole had been saving a 12-year-old boy 30 years gone. That the whole thing had never been a story about one woman being rescued or one woman doing the rescuing, but about a knot of broken people who'd each in helping her gotten to mend a thing in themselves they'd given up on mending. We're even? She agreed softly. But I'll tell you what, Mr. Cole. Even or not, you ever tire of digging another man's coal? There's a place on this ranch for a man who'll cross a breaking ford to strike a blow for a stranger. Ethan and I have talked it. We mean to grow this place. We'll need good men. And I'd sooner have one who knows what it costs to lose ground than 10 who never learned. She looked up at him. The offer's open. Whenever you're ready to work your own dirt again, instead of a company's, it'll be here. Cole didn't answer right away. He looked out over the Caldwell ground a long moment, the green coming up the ground that a man in a good coat had tried to take and failed, and something in his hard face that had been shut for 30 years opened just a crack. I'll think on it, he said, rough. I'll think hard on it, ma'am. A man my age had give up thinking he'd ever work his own dirt again. He gathered his reins. You keep that offer warm. I just might come collect it once the ore's hauled and the camp's paid off. I just might. He rode on, and Clara watched him go. And this time she did not think the way she'd once have thought, that he'd forget the offer the moment he was down the road. She'd learned that much at least in the turning of this 1 year. Some offers get collected. Some roads run both ways. Some people, once you've crossed a breaking ford beside them, don't forget you. The ranch grew the way she'd told Cole it would. The spring buyers came in April the way Ethan had promised they would that first hollow afternoon, and they bought what the Caldwells had cured past their own needs, and the money went to seed and stock, and a new hinge for the smokehouse door at long last, so that Ethan's coat could hang on a hook where it belonged, instead of jammed in a gap against a storm. And the herd came back slow over that year and the next, and the harvests came in, and the ranch that the whole valley had watched dying became over 3 years. The ranch, the whole valley pointed to the one that had come back from the edge of ruin. The one with the woman running the smokehouse, whose name got spoken now in the same breath as the best in the county, and they came to her. That was the turning Clara marked more than the herd or the harvest or the money in the bank. They came to her. Young ranchers who'd inherited a smokehouse they didn't know how to run, and their fathers before them too proud to ask, came to Clara Whitmore Caldwell to learn how to cure meat that would last a winter without rotting from the inside where you couldn't see. Women from the valley came to sit in her kitchen. The storekeeper's wife became over those years something near a friend, and Clara, who had spent 30 years at the edge of every room watching the warmth without expecting to be asked in, became a woman. Other people came toward a center instead of an edge. A woman whose door people knocked on, hoping to be let in. You've got a whole valley coming to your door now. Ethan said to her one evening, years on the two of them by the smokehouse fire, the way they'd started older. Now the ranch solid under them, the deed with both their names on it locked in the box in the house. You remember the first night. You told me you'd stood at the edge of every room you'd ever been in. And now they come to your door. They cross the valley to sit in your kitchen and learn at your smokehouse. You turned yourself from the edge into the center, Clara. I watched you do it. Took years, but you did it. I didn't turn myself into anything, Clara said. She was turning a batch her hand slower now, but sure as ever. I'll tell you the truth of it the way I've always told you the truth. I didn't change one single thing about myself in all these years. I'm the same woman who walked up your road with a bag of salt. Same size, same face, same trade, same hands. The town didn't come to my door because I got better. I was always this good. I told you that the first week, standing in this smokehouse, I said I was the richest woman in the county the minute I picked up my tools, and I didn't care who knew it or who believed it. She set the hook and turned to him. The only thing that changed Ethan in all these years is that I stopped waiting for them to see it and started living like it was true, whether they saw it or not. And it turns out that when you stop waiting to be seen and just live like you're worth seeing, folks start seeing. Not because you changed, because you quit apologizing for taking up room in a world that spent your whole life telling you not to. Ethan looked at her across the fire. The woman he'd married, older and grayer and surer than ever, tending the batch on their own ground in the smokehouse she'd brought back from the dead the day she brought him back from it too. "Your daddy'd be proud," he said. "The way you always say I hope his ghost isn't watching when you burn the apple wood too early." Clara laughed the low, warm laugh he'd loved for years now. "My daddy'd be proud I finally learned the thing he spent my whole childhood trying to teach me," she said. "Not the curing. I learned the curing young. The other thing. The thing he told me curing hogs in other men's smokehouses, and I nodded at and didn't believe till I was near 40 years old." She looked around the warm smokehouse, at the fire, at the beams, at the ground that was hers, at the man across the flames who'd handed her a rusted key and let her be somebody. That a person's worth was never in what other folks could be bothered to see. It was in what she could make with her own two hands, and in whether she'd bother to keep making it after the whole world told her not to. My daddy made the best cured meat in 3 states, and died humble in other men's eyes, and never once let it price him down inside himself. I used to think that was the sad part of his story, that he was worth so much and got so little for it. She fed the fire. "I don't think that anymore. I think that was the whole of his strength. He knew what he was worth. He didn't need the world to agree. And he handed me that along with the trade, and it took me 40 years to unwrap it, but I unwrapped it, and it's the only inheritance I ever got, and it's worth more than this whole ranch." The fire burned low and steady. Outside, the valley lay quiet under the coming dark, the Caldwell ground green and solid, the herd fat, the cellar full, the smokehouse warm, and inside it stood a woman. The whole county had once counted out curing meat on her own land. Her name on the deed, a good man across the fire, a valley that came to her door, and an inheritance of self-knowledge that no drought and no storm and no man in a good coat could ever drought or freeze or price down at the store. She had walked up that road with a bag of salt and a lifetime of being told she was nothing. She had lit a dead fire and turned a scornful crew and held a batch through a killing storm and crossed a breaking ford, throwing her whole counted-out body against a falling horse, and stood up on a wagon in front of 400 strangers and beaten a clever man in a courtroom with nothing but the truth, and given a family their winter, and turned herself from the edge of every room into the center of one. And she had done all of it the same way, the only way she'd ever known, by being twice as good as anyone expected and refusing ever to believe them when they said she was less. And that, in the end, was the whole of it, the thing her father had taught her, and the thing she had finally learned, and the thing this valley would tell about her long after she was gone, that Clara Whitmore's worth was never once decided by the men who couldn't be bothered to look at her, and never once diminished by the years she spent unseen, because a person's true value does not wait on the world's permission to exist, and no one, not a scornful town, not a cruel merchant, not a lifetime of being counted out, can take from a soul the worth she carries in her own two capable hands.